Chapter 452, A Little Fatter. 1. Chu Lian hadn't expected such a brazen action from him. She glared at him fiercely as a warning. But who could have known that Changdi knew nothing of restraint? He continued to rub that soft and perky area with force. He leaned against Chu Lian, resting his head on her shoulder. He sniffed the faint sweet smell of her body and touched his lips to her reddened earlobes. He requested in an overbearing manner, "Liana, you'll share a carriage with me tomorrow." Chu Lian felt that her lunatic husband had suddenly turned into an extremely possessive child ever since he had gotten injured. With what he just said, she was able to deduce the reason behind his actions earlier. Chu Lian asked helplessly, "What about Sister Hui then?" Sima Hui was a lady after all, so she couldn't just squeeze into a warm pen with the two of them. Furthermore, she had a good relationship with Sima Hui. The female general had taken good care of her while she'd been staying at the border camp. It wouldn't be right for her to set Sima Hui aside just to accompany He Sanlang. She'll be fine in a carriage by herself. After getting ignored by his wife the whole day, He Sanlang was starting to become obstinate. Chu Lian could almost feel sweat drops on her head. How had she not realized before that this man was so stubborn and possessive? He was even getting jealous over another woman. From what she understood about He Changdi, Chu Lian knew that if she didn't give him a proper answer now, there would be no end to this tonight. Chu Lian put her hands on his chest and forcefully pushed him away to create some space between them. He Sanlang looked at her with his head tilted downwards, obviously displeased. Chu Lian stared up at his handsome face and broke out into a smile. Her beautiful eyes formed into crescent moons. Watching her smile was like watching a fragrant flower blossoming instantly, and it dazzled He Sanlang. Chu Lian suddenly hooked her arms around He Changdi's neck and forcefully pulled him down. He Sanlang obediently bent over until his head was at the same level as hers. Their gazes met. Chu Lian could see every single eyelash of his clearly. The smile on Chu Lian's face widened a little more. She set her lips next to He Changdi's ear and whispered something. Once Chu Lian was done speaking, He Changdi's icy expression melted away, only to reveal sparkling warmth beneath. His pupils dilated until his eyes were like black holes, as if trying to suck her into his soul. With a husky voice, he sought confirmation from her. "Really?" Chu Lian refused to repeat herself, so she just continued smiling at him with her arms around his neck. He Changdi lifted her up with one hand at her waist and the other under her butt. With just that small bit of effort, he managed to carry her like a child, scaring her into tightening her grip on his neck. This was a lucky moment for He Sanlang. While Chu Lian was panicking, she pressed her chest against his face unintentionally. When Chu Lian finally noticed what was happening, her face was red beyond belief. He Sanlang's leg still hadn't completely recovered, so despite how excited he was, he didn't dare to make any more rash moves. After carrying Chu Lian for a while, he put her down. He personally neatened up Chu Lian's disheveled clothes, before warning her with a deep voice, "You can't lie to me, or you'll face the consequences." The blush on Chu Lian's face hadn't receded yet, so when she heard what he said, she could only nod silently to gloss over it. When it was time for dinner, Liu noticed that his master was in a much better mood than usual. He only dared to peek at him from time to time, wondering just what could have happened to make third young master this happy. Seated beside her husband, Chu Lian could obviously sense the change in him as well. The normally quiet and restrained He Sanlang was now breaking out into smiles occasionally while eating. She held up her rice bowl to hide the roll of her eyes she couldn't hold back. She had only promised to consummate their marriage when they returned to the capital. Look at how happy he had become from just that. The next day, they left Suzhou the same way they had arrived, with Chu Lian sharing a carriage with Sima Hui, while He Changdi sat alone. Liu found it really odd. Third young master's good mood hadn't faded at all since he had boarded the carriage. Third young master didn't even order him to disturb third young madam during lunchtime. When Chu Lian had set out on the journey to the north, she had taken small, desolate roads so that she could get there as quickly as possible. It was different now since they weren't in a rush. She went shopping on the whole journey back to the capital. Furthermore, Sima Hui was someone who knew how to have fun, just like her, so they went around looking at all the shops and shopping crazily. She purchased plenty of local specialities along the way. Sima Hui was from a wealthy family, while Chu Lian had never lacked for money since she opened Guilin restaurant. Thus, during the journey to the capital, the two ladies spent at least 3,000 taels between them. The carnage completely shocked Lai Yu into speechlessness. He mulled over how the amount third young madam had just spent was about the same as all that he and third young master had brought when they had left for the northern border. Seeing how much of a spendthrift third young madam was, he worried over whether third young master would be able to support her lifestyle. He Changdi, on the other hand, didn't seem to care at all. He even ordered Lai Yu to follow Chu Lian, take note of what she liked, and report everything back to him later. Their trip continued in this manner until Chongju, where Great General Qian and the other officers caught up with them. From then on, the pace of their journey to the capital got even faster. Even though the pace had increased, it still took approximately 20 days. When they reached Zhongju, the closest city to the capital, He Sanlang was already able to ride a horse as per normal. They bumped into Prince Jin and He Erlang there, who had just settled the corruption case in Zhongju, and decided to return to the capital together after some discussion. Although Chu Lian and the others hadn't arrived at the capital, they had already sent letters ahead of them. Everyone, including Matriarch He, Countess Jingan and Princess Duanjia, was eagerly waiting for the couple to return by now. Chapter 453, A Little Fatter, 2. He Changdi shared a carriage with Prince Jin. They hadn't met in a long time but they still got along like they hadn't parted. Prince Jin seemed much more haggard than before. There was now a gloomy cast to his abnormal azure eyes. He had also become thinner. He Changdi glanced at his close friend and personally filled his cup. The alcohol warming up over the brazier today was milk wine, a local specialty of the north. Its alcohol content was low and it was nourishing for the body. They wouldn't get drunk on it either, so it fit this occasion very well. Your Highness, did you find anything while investigating the corruption in Zhongju? The gentle and refined Prince Jin kept his silence for a while, before raising the small cup and downing the alcohol like it was a form of release. He then picked up the pot of wine and downed another 3 cups before he managed to calm his emotions. RDI, I found something. He Sanlang's eyes were as dark as the boundless night sky when he looked towards his friend. Nothing changed in his expression, as if he had already expected the answer. Prince Jin's brows drew together and he tightened his grip on the cup. RDI, you knew this would happen a long time ago, didn't you? He Sanlang also downed his cup of milk wine in one go. His silence was as good as an answer. Back then, before you left for Liangju, you suggested that I should investigate this case because you already guessed what was happening. Bitterness surfaced at the bottom of He Sanlang's heart. He hadn't guessed it at all. He had experienced it all himself once. That agony was something he didn't want his friend to experience again. Since he had reincarnated, he had to let his good friend see for himself the true nature of that pair of mother and son. Even though I'm a close friend of your Highness, there are some things that you wouldn't believe even if I said it outright. He Sanlang finally spoke up. The light in Prince Jin's azure eyes faded even more. He stared into thin air blankly for a while, before letting out a chuckle. You're right. If I hadn't seen it for myself, if it hadn't investigated it myself, I wouldn't have believed it even if you said it right to my face. However, now the ugly truth had been presented right in front of him. He had no other choice but to believe it. What a joke. So the people he had cared for the most had always thought of him as a chess piece that could be sacrificed at any time. He was merely a shield for the crown prince. In He Sanlang's past life, Prince Jin had been framed and sentenced to death because he had blindly trusted the ones he cared about so much. Back then, even though He Sanlang had warned him, Prince Jin hadn't taken what he had said seriously. Much later, when the matter had been brought to light, it had been revealed that Prince Jin had been framed. By that time, despite wanting to save his best friend, He Sanlang had his hands tied because House Jingan itself had been in imminent danger. The two men fell into silence within the carriage. After a long period, Prince Jin finally spoke. RDI, I feel terrible. Drink with me. He Sanlang didn't speak a word. His only action was to pour out wine for Prince Jin personally. Prince Jin finally recovered a little of his spirit after taking a nap in the carriage. He tidied up his hair, got off the carriage and switched to horseback together with Enchanting. The two handsome men, one dressed in black and the other in navy, riding side by side under the warm sun, formed an extremely eye-catching scene. One of them had a warm and elegant aura, while the other was more cool and stern. Prince Jin's smile evoked thoughts of spring, while Sanlang's handsome features were cloaked in a cold yet remarkable air. They were in the outskirts of the city where the roads were wide and the weather was sunny today. Chu Lian couldn't take being stuck in the carriage any longer, so she asked Sima Hui to teach her how to ride a horse. Sima Hui specially ordered her female adjutant to prepare a gentle chestnut mare for Chu Lian, as well as a proper saddle, before she began teaching Chu Lian the basics. Chu Lian had always been both intelligent and daring. In less than 30 minutes, she was already able to use the reins to control the horse and was trotting down the highway. Right at this time, they heard the sounds of fast hoofbeats from behind, so the two ladies turned around in confusion. It was Prince Jin and Enchanting who were coming their way. Although it wasn't Sima Hui's first time going to the capital, she had never met the fourth prince before. The man who was riding his mount over from a distance had eyes that were of a strange color. Although there was nothing reflected in those light-colored eyes, Sima Hui felt as if she saw a shadow of herself in them. Afraid that Sima Hui might not comport herself with the proper manners towards Prince Jin, Chu Lian hurriedly mouthed the words fourth prince at her. With the help of Chu Lian's hint, a trace of realization dawned upon Sima Hui and she recalled the little that she had heard about him. She had previously heard that the fourth prince was different from most people, but she hadn't thought that it referred to his eyes. In the imperial family, different colored eyes weren't considered auspicious. Considering the fact that his birth mother, concubine Xian, had passed away when he was still a child, one could imagine that his days growing up in the palace weren't easy. Sima Hui had also lost her parents when she was a child, so she sympathized with Prince Jin's plight. A hint of kindness and tenderness showed in the gaze she directed at him. Prince Jin's abnormal eyes aside, his looks were on par with Enchanting's. They were both extraordinarily handsome men that were hard to come by. When Sanlang and Prince Jin approached them, Chu Lian greeted the prince with a smile. "Greetings, Your Highness. Genie, we haven't met for a few months, but you've somehow gotten a little fatter instead in the north." Chapter 454, Returning Home, 1. The corner of Chu Lian's mouth twitched. Nothing good ever happened each time she met Prince Jin. He hadn't left a shred of mercy in his words for her. Didn't he know that women hated being called fat? Furthermore, it was the frail-looking and thin type of beauty that was favored in the Great Wu dynasty. Chu Lian managed to squeeze out an awkward smile for Prince Jin before introducing Sima Hui to him. Sima Hui had a straightforward and brave air to her because she spent so much time in the army. She had traded the reserve that most noble ladies had for an easygoing and dignified attitude. Somehow, the fourth prince who rarely interacted with unfamiliar ladies got along with her rather well. Chu Lian followed behind them while holding the reins of her mare, looking at their backs with the spark of an idea forming. The author of the original story had only mentioned Sima Hui in a single line. From what she knew, the fourth prince had never even met Sima Hui before. However, the two of them seemed like old friends right now. Chu Lian's almond-shaped eyes were sparkling bright now. Even her lips had tilted upwards in a curve. Just as she was immersed in her thoughts, her horse suddenly changed directions and tried to head towards the side of the road, giving her a fright. When she quickly turned to look, she realized that it was all Sanlang's doing. She complained, "Enchanting, what are you doing?" Sanlang turned to her with a faint smile as he continued leading her horse away. "Teaching you to ride." Chu Lian cried out in alarm as the gentle mare under her suddenly started galloping. Her face turned pale from fright. Just as she felt as if she were going to fall off the horse, something tightened around her waist and pulled her up into the air. When she finally regained her senses, she was already sitting on Enchanting's mount. Chu Lian was still in a panicked state. She gripped tightly onto Sanlang's narrow waist once she was ensconced in his embrace. Despite having only one hand on the reins and one arm around Chu Lian, Enchanting was at ease even as his steed was galloping freely. As they traveled under the clear sky, There was a warm and genial smile on He Sanlang's face that had never been seen before even in his past life. Once Chu Lian had recovered her breath, she pinched his arm forcefully in anger. He Changdis' eye twitched in pain. He lowered his gaze helplessly. Chu Lian, if you continue pinching me that hard, I'll lose my grip on the reins and really fall off the horse. Chu Lian glared at him fiercely. You're not allowed to do that anymore. He Sanlang looked down and placed a kiss on her smooth, flushed cheek. Then you can't let anyone else teach you how to ride next time. Only I'm allowed to teach you. I know how to ride now, so there's no need for you to teach me. It wasn't hard to ride a horse. The hard part was getting used to the bumpy ride. He Changdi raised an eyebrow in question. Are you sure you've already learned how to ride? Chu Lian refused to give in. Didn't you watch me just now? I was riding that horse perfectly well. Just as Chu Lian finished speaking, He Changdi urged his horse on with a low shout. The handsome steed responded by opening up its stride and flying into a gallop. The scenery on either side turned into a blur and the ride turned even more bumpy. Chu Lian was frightened by the sudden speed and clung tightly onto He Changdi. Somehow, she could still hear He Changdi's husky, magnetic voice by her ear. Are you still sure that you know how to ride a horse? Chu Lian had already realized that this fellow was purposely teasing her. Her cheeks were flushed red with anger as she exclaimed, He Changdi, why are you so childish? The only response she could hear through the winds blowing past was He Changdi's bright and open laughter, which she could feel through his shaking chest. Chu Lian was startled. She couldn't help but look up at He Changdi's sharp jaw. Right now, he had lost all of the gloominess that had always been present on his face ever since she had met him. He was genuinely and truly living in this happy and warm moment now. Chu Lian suddenly had the urge to freeze time to keep him in his current state, freed of all his worries and burdens. She tightened her hold around him and buried her head into his chest. Having lost all desire to retort to him, she broke out into a wholehearted smile. By the time the couple returned to the group, an hour had already passed. The fierce winds they had encountered on horseback had messed up their cloaks, so He Sanlang and Chu Lian both looked a little haggard. However, the messiness of their clothes couldn't hide the pure joy on their faces. He Changdi personally escorted Chu Lian to her carriage. Xiao Hongyu eyed the two of them from not too far away with shining eyes. He scared to himself and let out a chuckle with a wretched expression. Doesn't brother he know how to control himself? We're still on the road here. He just took sister-in-law out like that. Zhongmai had no idea what to say to the brat. He glared at him and threw a chestnut at his silly head. You little brat. What are you thinking of in that head of yours? Xiao Hongyu held his wounded head in a pitiful manner and protested. Brother Zhong, you're not allowed to hit my head. My mother already thinks I'm stupid enough. If you keep hitting my head, I won't be able to get a wife in the future. Captain Guo burst out into raucous laughter while watching the two banter. The victory in the war against the Tuhuns had lifted the mood of their long-suffering soldiers. They entered the capital on the second day of the second month of the lunar calendar, the day of the Longtaitu festival. The Chengping Emperor had sent officials from the Ministry of Rites to welcome them 5 kilometers out from the capital. General Qian and his troops would have to change into special ceremonial armor and enter the capital under the lead of the officials armed with ceremonial weapons. They would then enter the palace for the official bestowal ceremony. This was the highest honor that could be given to a military official returning home. It was also due to this arrangement that Prince Jin and Chu Lian had to part ways with the border troops when they were close to the outskirts of the capital. Chapter 455, Returning Home, 2. At the 5-kilometer mark out from the capital, Chu Lian bid goodbye to He Changdi and followed He Erlang back into the capital. As for He Sanlang's party, they would have to head straight to the palace to attend the ceremony before they would be allowed to return to their estates. In the afternoon, Chu Lian finally reached the entrance of the Jingan estate. They had already sent some of their family's soldiers ahead to report their return. Just as Chu Lian's carriage stopped, the sound of excited female voices carried in from outside. Third young madam, you're finally back. Xian had been trying to put on the steady air that a handmaid should have, but who could have thought that she would lose control of her emotions even before seeing Chu Lian in person? Her voice was almost close to a sob. Wenqing, who had been seated in the carriage with Chu Lian, leaped out to lift the curtains covering the entrance of the carriage. She shot a speechless look at Xian before teasing her. You missed third young madam that much? What are you blanking out for? Come and help third young madam out. It was only then that Xian came to her senses and looked up into the carriage. As expected, she was met with the sight of Chu Lian trying to hide a warm smile. She quickly wiped away the tears in the corners of her eyes and reached out to hold Chu Lian steady. Third young madam, please excuse this servant. Chu Lian let Xian help her out of the carriage before speaking with affection. All right, that's enough. I'll forgive you this time. Once she was out of the carriage, Chu Lian spotted the group of people standing at the entrance. The one in the lead was the kindly matriarch He. Her mother-in-law, Countess Jinggan, was standing right next to her with the help of Miaozhen. Chu Lian's gaze slid down to Miaozhen and she noticed that her clothes were loose, while her belly seemed to have swelled a little. A brief wave of emotion passed through her. She hadn't expected Miaozhen to have gotten pregnant with her brother-in-law's child so quickly. Her gaze shifted again, only to be met with two strangers. A middle-aged woman was standing to matriarch He's right. Her face was rounded and she was dressed richly. However, that unbridled measuring look she had on her face only drew dislike. If she looked a little closely, the middle-aged woman's features were a little similar to matriarch He. Standing behind the middle-aged woman was a tall young lady. The young lady seemed to be about her age. She was dressed in a bright pink dress with a vest on top. An exquisite fox fur-lined cloak was wrapped around her. The strings of pearls on her golden hairpin shook gently in the breeze. Her outfit seemed strangely familiar to Chu Lian's eyes. The girl seemed a little timid as she shied away from meeting Chu Lian's eyes directly. She darted glances at Chu Lian from underneath her lowered lashes from time to time. Xian noticed the misgivings in her master's eyes and whispered behind her, "Third young madam, those two are eldest madam and Miss Pan. They returned to the estate right before the new year." Eldest madam? Miss Pan? Chu Lian thought back to the events described in the story, but it seemed like those two had never been mentioned at all. However, she had heard her mother-in-law mention that the matriarch had a daughter who had married far away. Why had they suddenly been brought back to the capital? Although Chu Lian had some doubts in her heart, she didn't show them on her face. She smiled sweetly and quickly walked towards matriarch He. When she was right in front of the matriarch, she curtsied respectfully before saying, "Granddaughter-in-law hopes grandmother is well. Granddaughter-in-law has returned." Following that, she bobbed towards Countess Jinggan and the rest. Matriarch He held on to Chu Lian's arm. "It's good that you're back." "Good, good. Quick, come into the estate. Look at how thin you've gotten, you must have lost so much weight." In the time it took to enter the estate, He Ying had already spoken up. "Mother, this must be Ardis' wife. Why don't you introduce us? It's my first time meeting this child." Matriarch He smiled. "What are you in such a hurry for? Liana has just returned. You have to let her take a sip of hot tea first at the very least. You'll have all the time in the world to chat with your niece later on." Since the matriarch hadn't acquiesced to her demand, He Ying pouted and followed matriarch He closely. Pan Nianzhen's eyes hadn't left Chu Lian once, even as she continued following behind her mother. Now that Chu Lian was in front of her, she didn't have to meet those piercing eyes that made her feel ashamed. She could rest easy and look her over all she wanted. She hadn't expected Chu Lian to be so young. She looked about the same age as her, although she was much shorter. Chu Lian was also dressed very casually. There was only a single dark green jade hairpin on her head and a lovely jade ring on her left thumb. She wasn't even wearing a single bangle. Pan Nianzhen felt that her looks weren't that bad and could be considered above average even in the capital. In the past, her face had been her pride. However, upon seeing the unadorned, fine features of Chu Lian, she suddenly felt inferior. Even though Chu Lian wasn't wearing any makeup at all, her face was still as beautiful as a flower. Pan Nianzhen trembled at the thought of comparing her looks with Chu Lian now. Pan Nianzhen crumpled the handkerchief in her hands and took in a deep breath. A thread of dissatisfaction wound around her heart. When she had heard that Chu Lian and He Sanlang would be returning to the estate today, She had specially ordered her maidservant to pick out the best outfit and accessories to dress her up. However, she couldn't even match up to Chu Lian in her plain and simple clothes. What Pan Yanjun didn't understand was that some things couldn't be earned with outer appearances alone. The jealousy in her heart built up until it was showing in her eyes. She had visited Chu Lian's Songtao court before. When she had inadvertently glanced at the book that one of the servants had been writing in, there had been lines of accessories recorded there that were all more valuable than whatever she had on now. However, Chu Lian hadn't worn any of those beautiful and lavish accessories and had dressed so simply. Was she trying to humiliate her and her mother? Chapter 456, Trifling Matters in the Estate. 1. Chu Lian followed Matriarch He and the others into Qingxi Hall. She had gone to the northern border with a mission. Although her letters had already informed the elders in the family of important matters such as the war or the Snow Mountain Mist's flower, there were many details Matriarch He was unsure of and wanted to hear straight from the source. In Qingxi Hall, everyone was seated while Chu Lian was pulled to sit by Matriarch He's side. The matriarch took a good look at Chu Lian from head to toe. It had only been half a year since they last met, but Chu Lian had actually changed a lot in that time. The baby fat on her face had receded, leaving only the charm and delicate beauty of a young lady. Her almond-shaped eyes were like clear springs, giving the impression that she could see through one's heart. Her figure had also become even more shapely than when she had left home. Although she had slimmed down a little, her body was more like an hourglass now. Her simple, unadorned robes were unable to conceal her resplendent beauty. The matriarch nodded inwardly. This journey had forged her granddaughter-in-law's inner radiance. When she was younger, she had traveled extensively with the previous count, fighting on the battlefield and killing bandits and foes. She had only settled down into the inner court when she had grown older. If not for the perspective she had gained from her time journeying in her youth that put her in a different league from other noble ladies, she wouldn't have been able to build such a large empire for House Jinggan when she returned to the capital. That was why she believed that ladies should not be confined to the boundaries of their own courtyard. Ladies also had to get out of their comfort zone and experience the outside world. It was precisely this train of thought that led her to allow Sanlang's wife to embark on the journey to the north. Discovering this change in Chu Lian obviously made her happy. As the matriarch looked at her lovable granddaughter-in-law, her gaze subconsciously drifted to Chu Lian's flat tummy. When she noticed Chu Lian's broad belt emphasizing her slender waist, she couldn't help but reveal a tiny bit of disappointment in her eyes. The fact that she was wearing such a tight-fitting outfit meant that she definitely wasn't pregnant. While the matriarch was sizing up Chu Lian had been watching her with a smile. Thus, she had immediately caught that speck of disappointment in the matriarch's eyes. She didn't show any reaction to what she had noticed, but she took down a mental note. Compared to how Chu Lian had grown taller and become more beautiful, Matriarch He, on the other hand, looked much older than before. Her grey hair had faded completely into white. The number of wrinkles on her round face seemed to have increased significantly. Her robes also seemed loose on her, indicating that she had lost a fair bit of weight. These observations made Chu Lian sigh inside. Before the matriarch could speak, Chu Lian asked, "Grandmother, you haven't introduced Aunt to me yet." It was only then that Matriarch He returned to reality. She smacked her own thigh in vexation. "Oh dear me, my mind isn't what it used to be. I've become more forgetful in my old age." She took Chu Lian's slender white hand into hers and pointed towards the middle-aged woman next to her. In a friendly tone, she introduced, "Sanlang's wife, this is your aunt. She became a widow several years ago. This autumn, I sent some servants to bring her back from Xiyang. The lady over there is your cousin, Miss Pan, the sole daughter of your aunt. She was born just 2 months after you, so the two of you are of the same age. Do take care of her in the future." Chu Lian stood up to give her aunt-in-law, He Ying, a formal greeting before turning to Pan Yanjun to give a less formal curtsy towards her peer. If not for the sake of giving Matriarch He face, Chu Lian didn't have to greet them so respectfully at all. Setting aside the fact that He Changdis' new title of Marquis meant that she was now a Marchioness, she already had the title of Honored Lady Genie. With her noble title, she didn't need to curtsy to He Ying and her daughter, who were practically commoners. He Ying looked at the plainly dressed Chu Lian and nodded haughtily. Although Pan Yanjun was jealous of Chu Lian, she was a timid person at heart, so she stood up properly to return the curtsy and greeted her, third cousin. Chu Lian shot Xian a look and the handmaid promptly hurried forward to hand over 2 exquisite pouches to her. She gave one pouch to her aunt-in-law He Ying, and the other to Pan Yanjun. With a smile, Chu Lian said, "These are just some trinkets I purchased in Sioux City. I hope aunt and cousin will like these." He Ying opened the pouch on the spot, and dumped out what was inside onto her palm. It was a white jade bangle. Judging from the smooth and glossy surface, she could tell that it was made of high-grade white jade at first glance. The arrogance in her eyes finally faded a little as satisfaction shone in her gaze. However, the fact that she didn't even thank Chu Lian made the matriarch throw a few looks her way for a bit. Chu Lian was stunned for a moment by the lack of reaction from the two. Eventually, she let it go and went back to her own seat calmly. Chu Lian told them about her experiences at the northern border. But of course, she hid some major events such as getting kidnapped, opening a market at the north, and He Changdi getting hurt. An hour later, matriarch He was visibly getting tired, so Chu Lian tactfully mentioned that she wanted to return to Songtao court to settle some tasks. Matriarch He allowed her to leave and told her to have a good rest. After some other pleasantries, she asked Chu Lian to have dinner here in Qingxi Hall later with He Changdi. Chapter 457, Trifling Matters in the Estate, 2. Once Chu Lian had left, matriarch He immediately reprimanded He Ying. "What were you doing? You've already lived for decades, yet your manners lost out to a young lady who has just come of age. You're the elder, but you didn't even have a first meeting gift for your junior. You even had Sanlang's wife give you a gift out of filial piety." The moment matriarch He chastised her, He Ying lowered her head and turned on the waterworks. The matriarch was angered further by her sobbing and crying. "Think about how old you are now. Yet all you know how to do is cry. What happened to your fierce streak from the past?" After this continued for some time, He Ying finally explained while sobbing, "Mother, did you think I didn't want to? It's not like you aren't aware of the situation we're in. Despite how I'm dressed today, every single of these items from head to toe all belong to you. Sanlang's wife is an honored lady. The palace sends out jewelry for the titled ladies during the New Year or other festivities. Sanlang's wife was able to casually give out this high-grade white jade. How could I have something suitable to gift her? Even if I did have something to give, she wouldn't fancy it. In any case, we're broke, so why should we care about dignity?" What her daughter said tugged on matriarch He's heartstrings, so she completely forgot about the rudeness He Ying had just displayed towards her granddaughter-in-law here in the parlor. Matriarch He sighed, forget it. I'm tired. Take Miss Pan back to your room to rest and come back here for dinner." He Ying obediently got up and left with Pan Yanjun, but the moment she left the parlor, she couldn't help breaking out into a smirk. After leaving Qingxi Hall, Chu Lian didn't go directly to Songtao Court. Instead, she went looking for Great Dr. Miao and carefully placed the Snow Mountain Mist's flower into his hands for verification. With a glance, Great Dr. Miao was able to confirm that it was the Snow Mountain Mists and he sighed in relief. Thank goodness third young madam returned in time. The treatment for this illness can't be delayed for much longer. Rest assured, third young madam, as long as this Snow Mountain Mists is used, I have a 70% chance of curing the Countess' old illness completely. Chu Lian curtsied respectfully towards Great Dr. Miao, which he accepted gracefully. He took the medicine and quickly went to the medicine room that House Jingan had prepared for him. By the time she returned to her own courtyard, another hour had already passed. Finally, Chu Lian had time to change her clothes and cleanse her body. She then laid on the sofa and shut her eyes for a quick nap. After napping for half an hour, Chu Lian got up to drink a cup of honey water and summoned senior servant Gui and Xian for a chat. "Has anything happened while I was away?" Senior servant Gui spoke first. "Third young madam, Mingyang has passed on." Chu Lian was startled, but she didn't reveal any other emotions on her face. There was no need to sympathize with someone who had betrayed her, so she simply asked, "Has she been buried?" Senior servant Gui nodded. Xian gave some silvers to the manservants at the corner gate to buy a casket and have her buried. They didn't have much affection for Mingyang here, so after exchanging a few words, they changed the topic. Xian handed the account books to Chu Lian, before passing on Princess Wei and Royal Princess Duanjia's messages to her. Finally she said, "Third young madam, Guilin Restaurant is still under the public accounts. It's already the second month of the year, but it remains closed. The matriarch has sent senior servant Liu to inquire about it several times. To prevent Guilin Restaurant from getting stolen, Xian had followed the solution that Chu Lian had left behind and closed Guilin Restaurant. However, as a restaurant, Guilin Restaurant couldn't possibly stay closed forever. Even if they didn't mind, their regular customers would probably come to the estate to make a fuss eventually. Amongst them was old Duke Zheng, who was someone they couldn't afford to offend. Chu Lian smiled. "You don't need to worry about this, I'll settle it." Hearing that made Xian relieved. Now that their masters had returned, they finally had a pillar to lean on, and they could stand tall as servants. After dealing with these important matters, Xian suddenly recalled the matter of Miss Pan coming to Songtao Court to borrow clothes. "Third young madam, as Miss Pan came to the estate in a hurry, she didn't have enough clothes. The new clothes that were made for you last year have all been borrowed by her." Realization dawned upon Chu Lian. It was no wonder she had found Pan Nyanzan's clothes so familiar. Those were the winter clothes made with materials that she had personally picked out. It seemed like Miss Pan wasn't actually as timid as she seemed. She was obviously a white lotus, someone who looked pure and innocent on the surface but was scheming inside. Chu Lian's fair fingertips tapped on the side of the teacup. "Momo, have someone investigate this new aunt of mine." Senior servant Gui beamed until her eyes turned into crescents. She could feel that third young madam had become even more mature after returning from her journey. Previously, she had only cared about matters regarding Songtao Court, but now she had learned to be vigilant and observant towards others. "Understood. This old servant will have it done, third young madam." As she spoke, senior servant Gui couldn't help but size up Chu Lian's body. Chu Lian rolled her eyes at her speechlessly. "I haven't even consummated my marriage." "Momo, you should stop overthinking things." Senior servant Gui and Xian's eyes widened. They had disbelief written all over their faces. The fact that she and He Changdi had not consummated their marriage was only known to the two of them as Chu Lian's close aides. They hadn't thought that the couple still hadn't consummated their marriage even after their trip to the northern border, so even senior servant Gui was starting to feel anxious. Previously, when He Sanlang had gone to the northern border with no known date of return, she had turned a blind eye when Chu Lian acted willfully, but things were different now. He Sanlang had become a marquis from his military accomplishments, and their third young madam was now a marchioness. Count Jingan was still alive now, but the day would come when Count Jingan passes his title to his heir. House Jingan's third branch would have to break away from the family then. Chu Lian's first son would then become the heir of Marquis Arnuen. Now that this concerned the survival of a noble house, it was a problem of epic proportions that they still hadn't consummated their marriage. Chapter 458, The Department of Appointments, 1. As Chu Lian's former wet nurse, senior servant Gui couldn't help but remind her, "Third young madam, it won't do for you and third young master to keep delaying this." Even without considering the future, they had the matriarch to deal with right now. The matriarch was expecting a great-grandson soon. There was also the sudden appearance of that eldest madam and Miss Pan. From how the mother and daughter pair had been acting, it was unlikely that they would be easy to get along with. They had managed to escape from the remote Siang to the glamorous capital, so it would be crazy to think that they would want to go back. If they didn't want to go back, getting Miss Pan to marry into the He family would be the best choice for them. Despite the fact that the second young master wasn't married yet, third young master was the most outstanding one amongst the brothers, so it was hard to say with certainty that Miss Pan wouldn't set her sights on him. Chu Lian knew that senior servant Gui was speaking out of consideration for her, but having such things spoken outright still made her blush. "Momo, I understand that. My husband was injured for some time before, so I've already promised him to consummate our marriage after we return to the estate." Chu Lian's words were a pleasant surprise to Xian and even more so for senior servant Gui. She couldn't help grabbing onto Chu Lian's hands. "Sixth miss, as long as your first child is a boy, your position in House Jinggan will be secured." Senior servant Gui was so overcome with emotion that she had actually called Chu Lian by her previous title from House Ying. Once Chu Lian had an heir by her side, it wouldn't matter even if He Changdis' love for her changed. Her position in the He family would be as unshakable as a rock. Taking Dalang's wife as an example, if Madame Zhu had a son, her relationship with He Changchi wouldn't have deteriorated to this point. If she had a son, even if she quarreled with her husband, the matriarch and the countess would have considered taking her side. In any case, no matter how high one's status was, there was still a need to birth a male heir as a noble's legitimate wife. Senior servant Gui wasn't exaggerating in the slightest. This was just how noble families were in the Great Wu dynasty. House Jinggan was better as there were fewer members and the men never took concubines. Otherwise, things would be worse than they already were. Chu Lian had never considered such matters in the past. She had only thought about how she could live her days well as a lazy bug who never lacked money. Things were different now that she and He Changdi were in love. She naturally thought of sharing in some of his burdens. It wouldn't do for her to remain a layabouts then. She didn't know what kind of post the emperor would give to He Changdi currently. If he received an important position, then as his wife, she would have to start socializing with others. For a whole afternoon, Chu Lian settled the many trivial matters in Songtao court. The Li siblings who had escorted her to the northern border had also returned to Prince Wei's estate after completing their mission. Chu Lian had ordered the siblings to bring back the presents she had gotten for Princess Wei and Princess Duanjia too. Chu Lian also ordered the servants to send the local specialties she had bought on her journey to the various branches of the family. By the time she was done, it was already evening. A burst of noise started from the entrance of the courtyard. Xian went off to take a look and happily returned to report, "Third young madam, third young master has returned." Chu Lian set aside the accounts that she had been looking through and ordered Fuyan and Jingyan to prepare a change of clothes for He Changdi. He Changdi was still clad in his silver ceremonial armor when he entered the estate. He headed straight to the bedroom after entering Songtao court. Chu Lian, who was right beside her desk, turned to see him walking in with big strides. She found it a little strange. "Why are you in such a rush? Is something the matter?" He Changdi set down the helmet he had been holding and took a seat by the desk without even changing his clothes. He beckoned Chu Lian over. Thinking that he had an emergency to discuss with her, Chu Lian quickly went to his side. However, before she could even open her mouth to ask, He Changdi had already wrapped his arm around her waist and pulled her into his embrace. With his tall build, his head was still at the level of Chu Lian's chin even when he was seated, which was why it was so easy for him to pull her into his embrace. The servants nearby were all shocked by the intimate actions between third young master and third young madam. In the end, it was the experienced senior servant Gui who quickly shot a signal at Xian with her eyes and had Xian chase the other servants out. Jingyan and Fuyan, who had just come out from the bathroom, were also dragged away by Xian. It had been months since Fuyan had last seen He Changdi. Third young master had become more mature and steadfast than before, and his face seemed more masculine and handsome. He looked like a diamond that had just come out of the rough, which made it even harder for women to draw their eyes away from him. When third young master pulled third young madam into his arms, there was a little more warmth and tenderness on his icy countenance. This was a third young master that no one in the whole of Songtao court had ever witnessed. Greed brewed in Fuyan's heart. A tinge of darkness flashed in her eyes as she wished fervently that she could be the one in third young master's arms at this moment. Fuyan's hands curled into fists under her long and broad sleeves. After one last look of longing, she was finally dragged out of the room by Xian. Chu Lian was feeling uncomfortable with her waist being squeezed and her body pressed flush on his cold armor. She pushed He Sanlang away and spoke with a blush, "The servants were still here earlier, can't you be more aware of your surroundings?" With a cold expression that was at odds with his loving actions, He Sanlang rested his head on Chu Lian's slender shoulders. They were so close that Chu Lian could hear his heart pounding hard. He Changdis' deep and magnetic voice resounded close to her ears, His Majesty has conferred the position of a fifth-ranked administrator of the Department of Appointments to me. A fifth-ranked administrator of the Department of Appointments. Chu Lian was so astounded that she didn't have the mind to pay attention to He Sanlang's misbehaving hands. Chapter 459, The Department of Appointments, 2. Chu Lian had just taken a bath in the afternoon and the main bedroom of Songtao Court was warm and comfortable, so she was only wearing a loose and comfy casual dress, which turned out to be to his benefit. He Changdi's slightly coarse palm slid right into her dress. He then gently caressed the smooth skin at her waist. Chu Lian's mind was churning at lightning speed. Although she wasn't well versed in the bureaucratic system of the Great Wu dynasty, she still knew a little. The system used in the Great Wu dynasty was pretty much the same as the Ming dynasty from history. Back in the Ming dynasty, there were 4 official departments recognized by all as the most lucrative: the Ministry of Personnel's Departments of Administration and Examinations and the Ministry of War's Departments of Appointments and Logistics. He Changdi had just been given a position at one of these lucrative departments. Although his rank wasn't very high, he did hold actual authority. A fifth-ranked administrator like him could stand up to a first-ranked official with an empty post. Any military official would have to go through his department in order to get transferred to other posts. It was only when the large hand sneaking around in her clothes gradually reached up and touched the ties holding her underclothes closed that she finally returned to her senses. She pulled down He Sanlang's misbehaving hands and glared at him. Feeling a little speechless, she said, "You're going to be facing trouble soon. How do you still have the mood to play around? What do you think His Majesty's intentions are? Your achievements at the northern border are already eye-catching on their own and the bestowal of your marquisate is unprecedented. Why would he still give you a position like this? Isn't this practically drawing a target on your back? The Chengping Emperor was playing a game of chess here, but doesn't he know that tall trees attract the woodman's axe? Bestowing a marquisate on He Sanlang and giving him a lucrative post, just what was the emperor trying to do?" He Changdi had only been mentioning this to Chu Lian offhandedly. He hadn't expected her to have read so deeply into it. So this little woman who normally only thought of how to eat better actually knew how to navigate the twists and turns in the imperial court. He had truly underestimated her in the past. At this point of time, Chu Lian was like a great treasure that had been discovered in the mud and He Sanlang was the one who had discovered her. Each time he found out how different she was, it felt as if his treasure had multiplied. He was both astonished and delighted. After recovering from his astonishment, he burst into a bout of open laughter. "Chu Lian, why aren't you happy that I've gotten such a lucrative post? Why are you complaining about your husband's position instead?" Chu Lian pushed at him, trying to break free from his embrace, but his muscular arms were like steel prongs, they simply refused to budge. She rolled her eyes at him. "There's no such thing as a free lunch in this world." He Changdi tightened his arms around her. "Don't move, let me hug you for a little longer." As he spoke, he rested his head back on Chu Lian's shoulder. Chu Lian assumed that he was trying to think, so she stopped struggling and stayed still. A good while later, He Changdi said, "Xiao Bojian has gone to the Ministry of Personnel. Although he isn't in the Department of Administration, it's still an important position." He Changdi's words made Chu Lian stiffen up as she found this hard to believe. If that was the case, then she found it even harder to understand the Chengping Emperor's intentions. Furthermore, in this life, Xiao Bojian was actually climbing up the ranks quicker than he had in the book. It had to be emphasized that in the original book, it was with the help of Chu Lian along with House Ying's full support that he had managed to enter the Ministry of Personnel 1 year from now. Who could have thought that his rise would be so much faster this time? Chu Lian was in He Changdi's embrace right now, so even though she hadn't made much movement, He Changdi detected the subtle stiffening of her body. He raised his head to look at her and stared into her clear eyes. He Changdi still didn't understand her. After numerous tests, he had confirmed that Chu Lian wasn't interested in Xiao Wujing at all. Furthermore, her disinterest went further than that. She was actually disgusted by him. Yet whenever he mentioned Xiao Wujing, there would be an obvious and strange reaction from his wife. It didn't seem like she was completely ignorant of Xiao Wujing's plight. He Changdi's eyes darkened, He had a faint feeling that Chu Lian was concealing something from him. Although he wasn't happy about that, if he turned to look at it from another perspective, he still had his whole lifetime ahead to spend with her. There was no need to worry that she would keep him in the dark forever. The couple cuddled for a while before Chu Lian urged He Changdi to take a bath and change out of his clothes. It was getting late and they still had to rush to Qingxi Hall for their reunion dinner. After he finished bathing, He Changdi donned a navy blue robe and a black cape with a chelin embroidered on the lower half. These were clothes that the estate had specially made for him this winter. He Changdi was a lot more well-built than before after training in the army. He had broad shoulders, a slim waist, and long muscular legs. He wasn't too slender and lanky, but he wasn't overly muscular and burly either. The robes complemented his tall and slightly muscular build perfectly. Even Chu Lian couldn't keep her eyes off him. When He Sanlang noticed her unending stare, a spark of delight flared up within him. However, his face remained as icy as ever. He even pretended to be indifferent as he said, "Have you stared enough? If you have, then come and tie my hair for me." Chu Lian didn't bother bickering with this weirdo and beckoned him over. "Come on, sit over here." He Sanlang walked to the dressing table and sat down obediently like a good puppy. Chu Lian then picked up the sandalwood comb on the table and started combing and tying up his hair. Thankfully, the simple hairstyle that Chu Lian had done was still passable. Once she stuck a white jade crown with a design that matched the hairpin she wore on his head, He Sanlang's poker face finally regained some color. He glanced at his own image in the mirror, coughed twice, and managed to squeeze out some praise. "Not too bad." TL note: I couldn't find an official translation for the departments mentioned here, so I did some research on them and came up with approximate titles. So if you were an official in the Ming dynasty, these are the 4 departments that are known to be lucrative posts. Why? It's because these were seen as easy jobs with the likelihood of bribes coming your way. Ministry of Personnel, Department of Administration, Department of Examinations, Ministry of War, Department of Appointments, Department of Logistics. I think it's quite clear why for the departments of examinations and appointments, as you can bribe these officials to smooth your way through the ranks. Even for upstanding officials, it's standard to give gifts in celebration, gratitude for promotions, etc. The Department of Administration is in charge of improving bureaucratic processes. From my own perspective, maybe you could bribe officials to push for a certain process that's beneficial for you. Asterisk not a historian in any way. Asterisk the Department of War, Logistics is quite clear too, because war supplies would be a huge source of income for merchants. Some bribes going the way of the administrator could help you get that business. Chapter 460, Reunion at Qingxi Hall. 1. Chu Lian glanced at his reddened ears with a smile and didn't argue with him. "Alright, I'm just going to change my clothes in the bathroom before we go over. Otherwise, well, make grandmother wait." After she finished speaking, Chu Lian turned and entered the bathroom. Xian had already prepared a change of clothing for her in the bathroom. Once Chu Lian had left the inner room, He Sanlang checked his reflection in the bronze mirror. Although it was just a normal hairstyle, he felt more and more satisfied as he looked at it. In the end, he broke out into a foolish smile. Luckily the maidservants of Songtao Court didn't catch him in his current state, or they would most likely have knelt for hours out of fright, thinking that their third young master was possessed. While waiting for Chu Lian to return from the bathroom, He Sanlang had already turned back to his usual cold and stern self. He sat by the table and picked up a storybook that he had seen Chu Lian reading often to pass the time. His brows creased together as he read. What was this story about? An abandoned wife living carefree? In the Great Wu dynasty, abandoned wives didn't even have a place in society, let alone being able to spend their days leisurely. Flipping back to the front of the book to look for the author's name, He Changdi snorted. Was this Snow Mountain Mists crazy? Their imagination was just too far-fetched. From what he could see, this person had probably been born with a hole in their head. His wife would come up with peculiar ideas from time to time. Could that have been due to reading Snow Mountain Mists books? He Changdi's heart was set afire with rage. He wanted to burn up this book. While He Changdi was thinking, a sound from behind caught his attention. When he looked up and turned towards Chu Lian's direction, his deep eyes immediately lit up. Chu Lian had grown a little taller after coming back from the northern border, and her old clothes didn't fit as well anymore. The newest garments made for her over the winter had been borrowed by Miss Pan, so she was wearing a dress that Princess Wei had given her right now. The dress was a bright red with complex patterns embroidered on the hem, cuffs, and neckline. The buttons were glossy pearls of the same size. Even though it was a winter garment, it was cut with a narrow waist that showed off Chu Lian's slim figure. He Changdi had actually never seen Chu Lian all dressed up before. He had always known that she was beautiful and that her looks were considered outstanding even within the capital. He used to hate her face so much that he didn't even want to look at her. Thus, he was completely stunned right now. The young lady reflected in his deep gaze was as breathtaking as the sunrise. When Chu Lian noticed his dazed expression, she tilted her head to one side with a smile, looking utterly adorable. "What's wrong? Have you been stunned by my beauty?" He Sanlang's body stiffened up as a twitch developed in the corner of his mouth. How had he been so foolish before? How could someone who could speak such shameless words be the former wicked woman Chu Lian? How had he been so blind? He had made himself so constrained and miserable. He Changdi tugged the corner of his lips downwards before ordering in a cold tone, "Let's go." Chu Lian knew that he was just shy and uncomfortable, so she ran after him with a giggle. After taking a few long strides forward, He Sanlang suddenly noticed that he had lost sight of Chu Lian behind him. He unconsciously came to a stop when he heard the sound of footsteps coming closer. As he stood in the corridor, lanterns cast a faint light on him from behind, accentuating his perfect posture and making him appear even taller and more handsome. It was only when the sound of footsteps in disarray drew closer that he Changdi turned slightly and looked behind him. He was met with the sight of a young lady holding the heavy hem of her dress chasing after him and trying to close the remaining distance of a few steps between them. The sound of her complaints came next. "He Changdi, why are you walking so fast?" When Chu Lian finally reached He Changdi's side, a sudden warmth encased her right hand, which had been hanging naturally by her side. By the time she came to her senses, her right hand was already in the grip of a large and slightly rough palm. He Changdi snorted, "You're really useless. Why are you walking so slowly?" Chu Lian was about to glare at him in response, when she was suddenly lifted into the air. She had actually been scooped up into a bridal carry by He Changdi. All the maidservants following behind them quickly lowered their heads and kept their distance from their masters. Xian felt very pressured. What was wrong with third young master? Why had he suddenly started going all lovey-dovey with third young madam without any warning? Could he not treat the servants like air and give them some time to react? Chu Lian shot a glance at the maidservants following along at a distance and turned to give Sanlang a helpless glare. Beaming from ear to ear, she fired off a question with a double meaning. "I might be slow, but aren't you going to wait for me?" He Changdi paused in his steps. His eyes seemed as dark as night against the light. Chu Lian knew that he was staring at her. She could even feel his warm breath on her face. "It doesn't matter how slow you walk in the future. I'll just carry you along just like this. You'll definitely be able to catch up to me." He Sanlang was usually socially awkward, so it was extremely rare to see him saying such warm and romantic words. It was even more heartwarming to hear such gentle words coming from a cold person like him. Even Chu Lian wasn't able to withstand his attack. Utterly defeated, she drowned in his tender love for her. She wrapped her arms around He Changdi's neck and buried her little head in his broad chest. He Changdi put some strength into his arms and lifted Chu Lian up a little more. After a short pause, he stated in a seemingly serious manner, "His Highness was right, you really are heavier than before." Chu Lian had still been immersed in his earlier sweetness. His remark immediately jolted her out of her daze and sent her into a fury. Grinding her teeth with hatred, she clamped her teeth on He Changdi's slender neck. Her little canines were really powerful. In her moment of impulse, Chu Lian didn't hold back, leaving 2 red rows of teeth marks on his pale neck. Chapter 461, Reunion at Qingxi Hall, 2. Her action caused He Changdi's entire body to tense up. In a low voice, he berated her, "Chu Lian, behave yourself. Chu Lian let go of him with a grunt. She flashed her little fist in his face, before she threatened with a whisper into his ear, "You're not allowed to say that I'm fat." He Changdi didn't know whether to laugh or cry. His wife was really stupid sometimes. She couldn't even tell when he was joking. Also, what she should be worrying about now wasn't her weight, but whether there were any marks left on his neck. This heartless woman. He Changdi still had a sense of propriety. When they reached the entrance of Songtao Court, he let Chu Lian down and switched to holding her small, soft hand. A young couple acting sweet in their own courtyard was one thing. If they did the same outside, then it would be inappropriate. Others would look down on Chu Lian as the lady in charge of the third branch and deem her undignified. He Ying and her daughter were living in Qingxi Hall now, so they arrived very early. They had already been seated next to Matriarch He for half an hour. Today was a rare reunion for House Jinggan. It wasn't just the young couple from the third branch who had returned, but the second son, He Changjue, had also returned to the estate. Even the grounded Madame Zhu and the bedridden Countess Jinggan had also come. Pan Nianzhen sat beside her mother, wringing the handkerchief in her hands. Her heart was in turmoil. She was preoccupied with thinking about what her mother had told her earlier in their room. Her second cousin would be coming for the reunion dinner tonight. The current head of the family had 3 sons and second cousin was the only one who was still single. He was working as one of the left military guards now. Recently, he had gone to Zhongju with Prince Jin to investigate a major case. Although he hadn't gotten as much merit as her third cousin, his future wasn't looking too bad. Each year, the emperor would pick out around 10 people from the left military guards to become imperial guards. Anyone would die for the position of accompanying and protecting the emperor. Furthermore, second cousin was already considered rather old for a bachelor. He had turned 25 this year. At his age, it would be hard to find a suitable noble lady in the capital for marriage. Therefore, a young girl of marriageable age like her with a clear family background and suitable social status would be the most ideal partner. If she married him, then she would be able to stay in grandmother's house. Under grandmother's care, her future wouldn't be too bad. Although He Ying had a lot of shortcomings, it was undeniable that she genuinely cared about her daughter's future. She was right. Marrying into House Jinggan would be the best outcome for Pan Nianzhen. Pan Nianzhen's mood was uneasy. Although she was timid, she wasn't stupid. At times, she was able to see things even more clearly than her mother. It was true that it would be the best if she could marry her second cousin. However, young girls at her age tended to have fantasies about love and be a little rebellious. Her heart beat uncontrollably when she thought back to that day at Plum Pavilion in Prince Weiss Estate and that unexpected glimpse. She had grown up in a small town in Xi'an and she had never seen such a perfect man before. Furthermore, he had purposely turned towards her with a gentle smile. At that moment, it was as if all the plum blossoms around her had bloomed at once. The elegant fragrance of plum blossoms had filled her head. It was hard for her to forget. How could there be such a good-looking man in this world? Later on, she had asked around and discovered that he was the top scholar from last year and old Duke Ying's prized disciple. The emperor had placed him in an important position despite his young age. Furthermore, he wasn't engaged yet. She had heard that his parents died early and his family had been poor. The only reason he had been able to participate in the imperial examination was due to the support of old Duke Ying. Since he wasn't from a noble house, there was nothing standing in the way of her becoming his wife. No matter what, she was currently a legitimate-born young miss of House Jinggan and Marquis Enyuan's cousin. As long as her mother was willing to bring it up with grandmother and as long as her third cousin-in-law was willing to put in a good word for her when she visited her maiden home, then it wasn't impossible for her to marry Xiao Bojian. While her second cousin was good, she still preferred the dangerously handsome top scholar, Xiao Bojian. If she could marry him, her uncle could also provide him some guidance and support. She would also be able to stand proudly in front of Xiao Bojian. Pan Nianzhen was one-sidedly making her own plans right now, as if all the good men in the world had to stand in line for her to pick as she chose. As if they would marry her just because she decided on them. Who knew where her confidence came from? There was a commotion at the entrance of Qingxi Hall. Senior servant Liu's joyful voice filtered in from the entrance, shocking Pan Nianzhen back to reality. Senior servant Liu spoke from the bottom of her heart, "You've finally returned. The matriarch has been missing you dearly. She has been asking this old servant about you at least once a day. Hurry, come in, all of you." A steady and captivating voice sounded in response, "I've caused Momo to worry." It was such a pleasant voice, like the poignant sound of a zither tapping on one's heartstrings, causing a person's body to turn numb. Pan Nianzhen quickly shifted her gaze towards the entrance of the parlor. There, she saw a man as handsome as the bright moon walking in with his hands clasped behind his back. His features seemed to be carefully sculpted. There was a cold air around him while his eyes were like frozen lakes with impenetrable depths. His thin lips were slightly pursed together, making him look fickle, yet irresistible. He looked handsome, tall and heroic. Dressed in an ordinary set of clothing as he was, he still gave off a noble aura. Compared to Xiaobo Jian, this person in front of her seemed more cool, reserved and imposing. Her heart beat incessantly in her chest. Pan Nianzhen broke out into a blush and stammered out shyly, Second cousin." Chapter 462, He Erlang Grows Up, 1. Pan Nianzhen couldn't really be blamed for her mistake. She had never met her second and third cousins, He Chongjue and He Chongdi, before. From what she had found out since arriving at the Jinggan estate, she only knew that third cousin was very good-looking and she knew even less about second cousin. He Chongjue rarely stayed in the estate and his whereabouts were usually unknown. Plenty of servants in the estate wouldn't be able to recognize their second young master, let alone Pan Nianzhen. She knew that third cousin-in-law, and second cousin were all coming to Qingxi Hall for the reunion dinner. Third cousin would certainly be arriving with his wife, so the person coming in right now couldn't be third cousin, as he was alone. It wasn't strange that she made a mistake at first glance. He Chongdi's 5 senses were acute. As soon as Pan Nianzhen had shyly called out second cousin, he had instantly swept his icy gaze over. That one look made her cold to the bone, as if she had been splashed by a basin of water during the coldest day of the winter. He Chongdi's glance caused Pan Nianzhen's whole body to freeze up. The blush on her face was especially laughable now. He Chongdi didn't correct Pan Nianzhen immediately. His brows wrinkled into a slight frown and he turned to look behind him. He stopped right at the entrance, as if he was waiting for someone. Chu Lian's face was flushed as she ran over holding up the hem of her dress. She lifted her head and smiled apologetically at He Chongdi. Her big, watery eyes gave He Sanlang the irresistible urge to touch her face. He Chongdi gathered the hands he had clasped together behind his back. He waited until Chu Lian reached the doorstep before extending his hand to help her slowly cross the step. Chu Lian huffed a little as she caught her breath. She secretly vowed in her heart that she would never wear this dress again. Although it looked good, it was too troublesome to walk in. It had been so tiring to walk the short distance from Songtao Court to Qingxi Hall. Moreover, He Sanlang laughed at her a few times along the way. If she hadn't stopped him, he would have thrown her over his shoulder and carried her into Qingxi Hall. Even though he had been scorning her for walking so slowly earlier, he had waited for her of his own accord when he had reached the door. It warmed up Chu Lian's heart. Although her husband was a little eccentric, he was a few times better than any other man. When they entered the parlor, Chu Lian wanted to take her hand out of He Sanlang's large palm, but he refused to let her go. Thus, Chu Lian was brought over to Matriarch He's side by He Chongdi like this. He Chongdi pulled Chu Lian along with him to greet Matriarch He. The matriarch was seated on the warm hearth bed. As she looked at the young matching pair in front of her, she was extremely pleased in her heart. One could tell whether a couple had a good relationship from their daily interactions. Based on how He Sanlang was doting on his wife, she could tell that they were currently in the honeymoon phase. It seemed she had made the right choice when she had let Sanlang's wife go to the northern border. The young couple had truly opened their hearts to each other. Their current state was completely different from when they had just gotten married. At that time, they had only appeared harmonious on the surface and they had actually been divided at heart. Matriarch He kept looking at Chu Lian's flat abdomen. Judging by how affectionate the young couple was with each other, It seemed like it wouldn't be long before she would be able to hold her great-grandson. She made a mental note to ask Great Dr. Miao to have a look at Sanlang's wife on another day and to help prepare her body for pregnancy. Chapter 463. He Erlang grows up. 2. Matriarch. He was full of smiles. Stop kneeling and get up. Look at you two. Both of you have lost weight. Do eat more later. While Matriarch he was happily asking all sorts of questions and showing great concern towards He Changdi, it had become awkward for Pan Yanjun, who was at one side. When Pan Yanjun had called out second cousin, she had drawn a glare from He Ying in response. She had also made a joke of herself in front of the maidservant that served her in Qingxi Hall. Luckily, the maidservant had managed to avoid laughing out loud by covering her mouth. She bent over slightly and whispered into Pan Nyanzan's ear, "Miss Pan, that was third young master, not the second young master of our estate." Pan Nyanzan's entire body stiffened up and her face turned ashen. What? This was third cousin? So he was really third cousin, who was already married. Actually, Pan Yanjun had already started questioning He Changdi's identity when Chu Lian had followed behind him and he had held her hand disregarding other people's eyes. It was just that her heart was reluctant to believe in it. By the time the maidservant had explained his identity to her, it was already too late to make herself numb. So that remarkable gentleman who had just walked past her was really the married third cousin. While staying in the Jingan estate, she had heard the servants gossip about third cousin's appearance. However, it was even more astonishing seeing him in person today. His looks could be compared to that top scholar she had seen at the Plum Pavilion in Prince Weiss estate. Moreover, the emperor had bestowed the title of Marquis An Yuan to third cousin after his great achievements at the northern border. Right now, the peerage of House Jingan was merely that of a count. Third cousin's title was even one rank higher than her grandfather's. Pan Yanjun couldn't contain the glow in her eyes. She didn't dare to lift her head, but out of the corner of her eyes, she looked at Chu Lian with much more envy and resentment. Soon after He Changdi and Chu Lian had settled down into their seats, the maidservant waiting at the entrance of the parlor announced the arrival of second young master. The curtains wavered slightly at first before they were lifted by someone on the outside with great force. At the same time, a tall and burly young man walked in gallantly. He Erlang was dressed in a black official's robe. He had a sturdy figure and a dark complexion. He looked very similar to He Dalang, but his facial features were more refined and prominent. He gave off the impression of a very masculine young man. He Erlang's appearance didn't really fit the current aesthetics of the Great Wu dynasty. However, if he had lived in modern times, he would have been quite popular among girls. He looked exactly like a typical manly man. That was Chu Lian's opinion of He Erlang, but it didn't mean that Pan Yanjun had the same thoughts. She was shocked stiff once He Changjue entered the parlor. In an instant, Pan Nyanzan's face turned deadly pale and she lowered her head in fright. She really hated boorish men like He Erlang. He looked no different than the shirtless laborers working on the docks. He Erlang looked like a classic example of a simple-minded person with all brawn and no brains. She lowered her head, pursed her lips and remained silent. Yet, He Erlang didn't even notice the sudden addition of a new cousin. He smiled and went up to pay respects to his grandmother. May grandmother remain healthy as always. Grandson gives a belated New Year greeting to grandmother. Matriarch he gave He Erlang a glare. A belated New Year? Don't you know what date it is? It's already 10 days into February. He Erlang rubbed the back of his head and laughed sheepishly as he was helped up by Matriarch He. Anger rose up in Matriarch He while looking at the cause of the thorn in her heart. You're not allowed to run off this year. I've heard that the Emperor intends to let you join the Imperial Guards. You had better seize this opportunity. Since you're in the capital now, let's also take care of your marriage as well this year. Just take a look around you. In this entire capital, are there any young masters around your age that are still single? Are you trying to make this old lady and your parents die of frustration? He Erlang normally hated it when the elders in the family mentioned marriage. Whenever the topic came up, he would lose his temper and patience. His next course of action was usually to avoid returning to the estate after that. However, His attitude had been completely reversed this time. He smiled and bent over at the waist to hold on to Matriarch He's arm. He looked like a big circus bear nodding and bowing to please people. Grandmother, I've made you worry in the past. This year, I'll listen to you and bring back a granddaughter-in-law for you. Chapter 464, Muxiang, 1. His words shocked Matriarch He. When had this brat become so sensible? The more she looked at it, the stranger it seemed. He Ying's eyes lit up after she heard He Erlang's words. She glanced at her daughter with clear intentions. Unfortunately, Pan Nianzhen was still looking down in a daze and she didn't catch the look her mother had thrown her way. He Ying furrowed her brows slightly as she looked at her absent-minded daughter. Matriarch He hadn't expected He Erlang to have suddenly turned so amenable to her requests. Her mood was currently better than it had ever been for some time. She called for everyone to sit down. There were only a few of them and they were all family, so they didn't separate the men and women for dinner. Everyone gathered around a large round table to eat. Fermented rice wine had been specially prepared for the occasion so the women could drink freely without fear of becoming drunk. Although they were not separated by gender for dinner, their seating positions had been specially prepared. He Daleng was sat to the left of Matriarch He, while Countess Jinggan was seated on her right. Chu Lian sat beside He Sanlang and Miss Pan was on her other side. He Erlang was seated across from Pan Nianzhen. For the reunion dinner tonight, Matriarch He had specifically ordered the kitchen to prepare a table full of dishes. There were also several new dishes that Chu Lian had instructed Xian to make in the main kitchen. The table was laden with a magnificent feast. He Ying looked at the exquisite dishes in front of her, before turning to smile at Chu Lian, Sanlang's wife. I heard about Guilin restaurant the moment I arrived at the capital. Everyone has been saying that the dishes at Guilin restaurant are the best in the capital. When will I get the chance to try them sometime? Before Chu Lian could answer, He Ying pinched Pan Nianzhen's hand under the table. While Miss Pan was shocked, she quickly reacted and continued the conversation. Mother, what do you mean by going to Guilin restaurant? Third cousin-in-law's Guilin restaurant hasn't been reopened yet. Upon hearing her daughter's words, He Ying looked surprised and smiled sheepishly. Chu Lian swept a cool gaze over the two women beside her. Her expression didn't show any hint of change and she maintained a faint smile on her face. Thanks to He Ying and her daughter, Matriarch He was also reminded of Guilin restaurant. The matriarch asked, Liana, what's happened to Guilin restaurant? Why hasn't it reopened yet? If it was only He Ying and her daughter asking about it, Chu Lian could simply smile and ignore them. However, now that the matriarch had personally spoken up, she couldn't continue pretending ignorance. Chu Lian replied in a serious manner, Grandmother, I was planning to make some changes to the layout of Guilin restaurant at first, so I told Xian to close the restaurant before the new year. The servants probably didn't dare to do anything else without my approval, since I wasn't in the capital. Thus, the reopening has been delayed until now. Now that I'm back in the capital, I'll work on reopening the restaurant as soon as possible. Matriarch He dropped her line of questioning and nodded. She advised, it's best if you can reopen it earlier. The old Duke of House Zhang has already sent his servants over several times to ask about it. Chu Lian nodded. Actually, she knew that it was actually the matriarch who was pushing her to reopen the restaurant. If old Duke Zheng really couldn't wait to eat those delicacies again, he wouldn't have sent people over to ask the matriarch. He would have come to look for her himself. He Changdis' thick brows wrinkled slightly as he listened to his grandmother's words from the side. The matriarch gave the order to start eating. Since it was a rare reunion, they disregarded the usual formalities and the whole family chatted while eating. Chapter 465, Muxiang, 2. He Sanlang spoke the least during dinner. He only gave some short replies whenever the matriarch asked him some questions. However, no one thought it was strange since he always kept a cold expression on his face. Senior servant Ju and matriarch He's two personal maidservants had also set up a small table in the side room. 3 dishes and a small pot of rice wine were enough for the 3 of them. Senior servant Ju noticed that Muxiang seemed preoccupied, so she asked, "What's wrong?" Are you still feeling unwell from that cold you got a couple days ago? Mu Xiang quickly shook her head. Momo, I'm fine now. If you're fine, then hurry and eat. These dishes are all your favorites. The matriarch specially told the cook in the main kitchen to make more for you. Mu Xiang stared at the appetizing dishes in front of her and scowled in her heart. She didn't like to eat these at all. Did these people really think that she was the former Mu Xiang? Seeing that Mu Xiang still looked weary, senior servant Ju muttered grudgingly, "What's wrong with this girl? She's acting like she's been possessed." Mu Xiang snorted in her heart. That was exactly it. Why else would she be in this lowly body? Mu Xiang promptly stood up. Senior servant Ju set down her chopsticks and frowned. "Girl, what's wrong with you?" Muxiang's eyes fell on the wall beside her. She suddenly lowered her head and innocently smiled at senior servant Ju. "Momo, since I don't really have any appetite, why don't I go and serve the matriarch?" Senior servant Ju thought that she was too dedicated to her work. She tried to persuade her otherwise. "Shang Yun and Ha Xiang are taking care of the matriarch. You don't have to worry. Momo, just let me go, please. I have nothing to do anyway. I just want to spend more time with the matriarch." Senior servant Ju had no other choice but to let her go. She reprimanded with a smile on her face, "Just go then, you silly girl. I knew you were a restless one. Everyone else can't wait to rest more, but you just can't stop working throughout the day." Mu Xiang curtsied towards senior servant Ju before she turned to walk to the parlor with a giggle. What senior servant Ju didn't see was how Muxiang's expression instantly changed after she left the side room. The previously pure and sweet smile morphed into a contorted expression. Mu Xiang tightly clenched her fists. Her heart was beating fast in her chest as she couldn't hold back the mix of emotions surfacing on her face. It seemed like there was agitation, agony, as well as excitement and tension. In short, various emotions were all mixed up, causing her originally pretty face to warp into a monstrous grimace. Her complex emotions caused her steps to become disorderly. Even though she was trying to restrain it, there was still a voice screaming in her heart. A voice that was trying to break through all the heavy shackles imprisoning it. "He Changdi, I'm finally going to meet you again. This time, I won't make the wrong choice anymore. You're my husband. In all our lifetimes, you can only be my husband." Muxiang's whole body was shaking like a leaf as she stepped into the parlor. Not because she was scared, but due to her extreme excitement and elation. All the masters of the He family were busy with their dinner, so they didn't notice Mu Xiang entering cautiously with light steps. Mu Xiang slowly lifted her head and looked towards the table in the center of the parlor. The moment her gaze landed on He Changdi, she couldn't pull it away. It was him. It was really him. That was the face that was engraved into her memory. Now that she could finally see his face again, she realized that it hadn't changed at all. Mu Xiang tightly clenched her hands, using nearly all her strength to prevent herself from jumping right into He Changdi's arms. While in the middle of eating dinner, He Sanlang suddenly turned his gaze towards one corner with cold, probing eyes. Mu Xiang immediately withdrew her gaze and took on a respectful pose with her hands to her sides. When He Sanlang looked over, all he saw was a familiar-looking maidservant. He was slightly puzzled, but he didn't think much of it. He lowered his head and continued eating. At times, he would pick some food from the dishes that were far away from Chu Lian and place them in her bowl. TL note: I can't believe some of you actually guessed this plot twist. W. Chapter 466. The End of the Family Banquet. 1. Chu Lian had never gotten such treatment from He Sanlang before, especially under the scrutiny of everyone. As thick-skinned as she normally was, this time, she couldn't help but blush. When no one was watching, Chu Lian shot a glare at He Changdi, who pretended not to notice it and continued putting food into her bowl. Chu Lian was feeling rather helpless about the situation, but she could only let him continue and pretend that there was nothing going on. However, when someone else noticed He Sanlang's loving actions, they were so jealous that their eyes almost turned red. Madame Zhu secretly glanced at He Dalang, who was only concerned with his own meal. Ever since she had been grounded, their relationship had grown even more tenuous. Now that Miaozhen was pregnant, he would occasionally go over to Miaozhen's room to rest for a night. However, he hadn't stepped into her room for months, even though she was his legitimate wife. The more she thought about it, the more her hatred and dissatisfaction grew. Conversely, it was Matriarch He who was happy with the loving young couple of the third branch. Since the two of them were so harmonious, she believed that she would be able to see a great-grandson soon. Pan Nyanzan's head was lowered to hide the disappointment in her eyes. She imagined how happy she would be if that person next to He Sanlang was her instead. Meanwhile, Mu Xiang stood to one corner, her wide sleeves hiding her clenched fists. She didn't even realize that her nails had pierced right into her palms. The mistiness over her eyes showed how lost she was. The image of that loving couple in front of her seemed to be both clear and fuzzy at the same time. Her mind seemed to be covered in a haze that made her unable to see clearly what was right in front of her. She was Chu Lian, who had been reborn into another body after her death in her previous life. Since that was the case, then who was that Chu Lian who had taken over her original body? Was that still her? A spark of wit flashed through her mind, clearing the strange daze she had fallen into. Her eyes instantly turned clear and fierce. How could it be her? She had never shown such an expression on her face ever. Mu Xiang wasn't stupid. As the original female lead, she was rather smart. Furthermore, she was a reincarnated soul, and that had made her even more enlightened than before. Since she had been able to be reborn into a maidservant's body, then it wasn't all that strange that her original body had been taken over by someone else. She was only curious who that person living in her original body was. Mu Xiang took in a deep breath and concealed all the doubts in her heart. She stared greedily at He Changdi one more time before lowering her head and transforming back into the old Mu Xiang. Since her enemies were out in the open, she had to hide herself in the shadows. The element of surprise was going to be her biggest advantage. After living a whole lifetime, she had to be even more careful in this one and plot carefully to get what she wanted. She had enough patience and willpower to wait for her prey to fall into her trap, never to escape again. The corners of Muxiang's lips curled up and she sneered sinisterly. Unfortunately, there was one factor that was out of the careful Muxiang's expectations. He Changdi was no longer the bright, innocent, handsome young man of the past. He was a man who had undergone the trials and tribulations of his past life. His personality was vastly different from before. He Changdi and Chu Lian had only just returned to the capital after many days of travel, so Matriarch He didn't keep the couple for too long. After they were done with dinner, she instructed them to return to their courtyard early to rest. The young couple then escorted Countess Jingan on the way out of Qingxi Hall. Since the main guests of the family banquet had left, there was no reason for the other family members to outstay their welcome. Chapter 467, The End of the Family Banquet, 2. It was He Erlang who bid his goodbyes first. Following that, He Daling stood up with a flourish of his robes, bowed towards the matriarch, and left the parlor just like that. Madame Zhu bit her lip after watching He Darlang's burly silhouette disappear behind the curtains of the entrance. Finally, she let senior servant Qiao help her up and they left together. Only Matriarch He Ying, and Miss Pan were left in the originally lively parlor. Matriarch He waved at her daughter in dismissal. "It's getting late. Why don't you go to bed too?" He Ying had been intending to stay back to discuss something with her mother. However, seeing the fatigue on her mother's face, she swallowed her words. She bobbed her goodbye together with her daughter, Pan Yanzhen, and left. By the time He Changdi and Chu Lian left Countess Jingan's courtyard, it was already dark. There were lanterns hanging on either side of the path, lighting up the estate with a warm glow. Xian and the other servants followed behind the young couple. After experiencing what had happened earlier, Xian kept her eyes on the ground and walked slowly, lagging behind her masters until there was some distance between them. She had trained the younger maidservants behind her well enough that they understood her actions and followed exactly as she did. He Changdi held on to Chu Lian's soft little hand and walked in front of her. It was still February, so the night was a little cold. Chu Lian's hand was completely enveloped by He Changdi's. She held up the hem of her heavy dress with one hand and stumbled occasionally as she was tugged along by him. She wanted to pull her hand out from his hold, but no matter how hard she tried, she couldn't. He Changdi suddenly paused in his steps and glanced at her, his eyes a pair of bottomless wells. Chu Lian looked up and caught sight of his pressed lips before her hand was abruptly released. In the midst of her surprise, He Sanlang had already bent down and grabbed hold of her slender waist with one arm while the other went under her knees. Following that, with a slight application of force, Chu Lian was now curled up in his arms in a bridal carry. Chu Lian let out a gasp in shock. When she finally regained her senses, she beat at his solid chest with a tiny fist, scolding him angrily. He Changdi, what are you trying to do? Put me down now. He Sanlang looked down at the woman in his arms and lowered his head to plant a quick kiss on her soft, fair cheek. His magnetic voice rumbled close to her ear with a warning. Behave yourself. Chu Lian was extremely vexed, but she knew that hitting him was only going to make her hand hurt. In the few months that they had grown close together, Chu Lian had already gotten a handle on his strange temperament. Thus, she pleaded in a soft tone, "Husband, put me down and let me walk on my own. Xian and the others are right behind." When the two of them were alone, Chu Lian would rarely call him husband. Most of the time, she simply addressed him as He Sanlang or He Changdi. Hearing such a tender, loving call from his wife, especially when she was curled up in his arms, sent a bolt of electricity racing down He Changdi's body. He stiffened up completely for a whole second. His deep gaze darkened even more until his eyes were like pools of ink, and his thin lips pressed into an even finer line as his strides quickened. All Chu Lian heard was his husky response. "Don't worry. It's night time now. They won't be able to see what they're not allowed to." When his breathing changed, Chu Lian finally realized what had happened. She wailed inwardly to herself. She hadn't used the right solution after all, she had just provoked the beast. Since she could feel the changes in his body, Chu Lian was in an absolute state of awkwardness. She kept a tight hold on the lapels of his shirt and gave up on trying to get him to set her down. Lying obediently in his arms, she tried negotiating instead. "Then could you put me down when we reach the corridor right before we enter our courtyard?" There were so many servants around Songtao Court. It would be so embarrassing if they spotted her like this. He Changdi kept his expression cool as he struggled with himself in his mind. Finally, he nodded and agreed to her request. Actually, his wife's body was all nice and soft. She felt so comfortable in his embrace that he didn't want to put her down at all. He wanted to carry her all the way to the bed in their room. Chapter 468, Nightclothes. 1. It went without saying that He Changdi absolutely wouldn't voice those thoughts to his wife. While trapped in his embrace, Chu Lian made a silent vow to never wear such an impractical dress again. It was beautiful to look at, but walking in it was just putting herself in trouble. He Sanlang was a man of his word. He put Chu Lian down by the decorative mountain in front of the corridor. However, he didn't just walk off straight after. Instead, he helped her straighten out her disheveled clothes before taking her hand and walking to their room in Songtao Court together. When senior servant Gui caught sight of third young master holding third young madam's hand, she couldn't help but smile. The moment He Changdi entered the parlor, he shot a signal at Wenqing, Wenlan, and senior servant Zhong with his eyes before pulling Chu Lian towards the bedroom. When senior servant Gui was about to enter the bedroom with Jingyan behind her to wait upon them, they were held back by senior servant Zhong. "Dear sister, there's something I need to discuss with you. Let's just have Wenqing stand guard here for today." Senior servant Gui glanced at the couple who had just disappeared past the curtains covering the entrance of the bedroom, then back at the smiling senior servant Zhong. Realization dawned upon her. She smacked herself on the forehead and admitted with some embarrassment, "Look at how muddle-headed I've gotten." Thus, the two senior servants sent away all the other nearby servants in tacit understanding, leaving only Xian and Wenqing in case third young master and madam called. Chu Lian's face began to heat up uncontrollably the moment she was pulled into the bedroom by He Changdi. She had a sinking feeling that He Sanlang wasn't going to let her off tonight. Thinking of the promise she had made to him back when he was still recovering from his wounds, Chu Lian was both shy and nervous. He Changdi had finally managed to get Chu Lian alone in the bedroom with him. There was no way he was going to remain restrained and reserved. At almost the exact moment the curtains fell behind them, Chu Lian was already wrapped tightly in his embrace. Chu Lian had a petite figure, so being bound by He Changdis' arms made her feel like she was being folded into his body. Her dainty cheek pressed against his chest. She could hear the strong and hurried thumps of his heart. The pace of his heartbeat seemed to be contagious as her heart also started to beat faster without her control. He Sanlang's large palms gently caressed her back, like he was reassuring a panicking kitten. He lowered his head and gently kissed her jet-black hair. In a deep voice, he asked, "Liana, do you still remember what you promised me?" Chu Lian's breathing came to a halt and her grip on his shirt tightened. She gulped nervously before putting on a strong front and mumbling, "Dinner was rather salty tonight. Husband, I want some water." She had truly run out of ideas. Otherwise, Chu Lian wouldn't have used such a crappy excuse to change the subject. She shut her eyes, filled with such embarrassment that she didn't dare to check his reaction. She hadn't thought much of it when she had made the promise, as she thought that it was something that would be over with in the blink of an eye. However, now that it was actually time to fulfill her promise, she couldn't help but grow nervous and scared. It was Chu Lian's first time in both this life and her last. She had also heard that it would be painful. So, she had suddenly turned into a scaredy cat and would take every opportunity to delay her impending doom. Chu Lian believed that her words would anger the bipolar He Sanlang. However, who could have thought that, just a moment later, all she would hear was his deep, pleasant laugh from above. With her head on his chest, she could feel him shaking with laughter. Chu Lian's blush instantly deepened. This guy was actually laughing at her. She pushed He Sanlang away in equal parts shame and anger before raising her head to look at his expression. The moment she saw his smiling eyes, Chu Lian became even more annoyed. He was actually laughing at her. "You're not allowed to laugh." Chapter 469, Nightclothes, 2. He Changdi was a good man who listened to his wife, so he endured his urge to laugh and wiped any semblance of a smile off his face. He reinstated his usual cold, indifferent expression. Coupled with the depths of his eyes, he looked rather fearsome now. Chu Lian felt dejected upon seeing how dignified he looked. His current demeanor made her even more nervous and embarrassed. Her face was stiff as the corner of her mouth tugged downwards. "It's better if you laugh instead." The hapless He Sanlang let her go and pulled her to the table by the hand. He checked the teapot there only to find out that the water inside had already turned cold. Thus, he sat Chu Lian down by the table before walking off to the outer room, where he ordered Wenqing to bring in her usual honey water. By the time He Changdi returned to the bedroom, Chu Lian was already gone. He Changdi's cold countenance cracked and he snorted. He shook his head with affection and helplessness. She was usually so capable, yet when push came to shove, she was actually a scaredy cat. However, what he had tonight was time. With this mindset, He Changdi walked out of the bedroom and kindly instructed Wenqing and Xian to wait upon Chu Lian. Chu Lian had been hiding in the bathroom. When she heard the footsteps of He Changdi leaving, she patted her chest in relief. Although this was the outcome she wanted, when He Changdi had actually left, there was an inexplicable feeling of disappointment in her heart. Before Chu Lian could return to her senses, Wenqing and Xian had already entered with something in their hands for her. "Third young madam, this is honey water at the perfect temperature for drinking right now." With a smile, Xian placed the cup in Chu Lian's hands. The blush that had just receded on Chu Lian's face resurfaced once again. She slowly took a sip from the cup before probing them. "Where's third young master?" Wenqing was already preparing hot water for Chu Lian's bath, so Xian was the one who answered. "I think he went to the study. Before third young master left, he instructed us to take care of you, third young madam." Chu Lian's mind was in a state of utter disarray now. When she saw that Wenqing was done with preparing the bath, she gestured for them to leave. She stepped right into the bathtub after disrobing. As per usual, her nightclothes were placed on the table behind the screen. Wenqing waited outside the bathroom. Afraid that soaking in the bath for too long might be bad for third young madam, the maidservant called out to her once 15 minutes had passed. Chu Lian was startled back to her senses by the call, so she got out of the bathtub, wiped herself dry, and reached out for her nightclothes. It was only after putting on the pale pink nightgown embroidered with a pair of mandarin ducks that Chu Lian realized how sexy it was. The color of the robes was already light in the first place, but the sheerness of it meant that it was as good as wearing nothing. Even the light green inner robe was completely visible. Seething with anger, she was about to call for Xian to bring in a different set of robes. However, once she recalled that it was senior servant Gui who was in charge of her clothes, she put that thought to rest. If she didn't wear this now, senior servant Gui would definitely torture her with a round of nagging the next day. Senior servant Gui genuinely wished the best for her, so she couldn't let her down. Chu Lian sighed. Looking at it from another perspective, since He Sanlang had already left, it wouldn't matter what she wore since she was alone in the bedroom. She took down the large cape hanging on the screen and wrapped it around herself before she left the bathroom. The fact that third young madam hadn't requested for a change of clothes made Xian very happy. She had still been in the middle of thinking up ways to make third young madam give up on changing into another set of clothes. Chapter 470, Nuptial Wine, 1. Xian helped Chu Lian with wiping her hair dry and anointed her with some perfume before taking her leave. The room was extremely warm and comfy because of the heated floors. There were also several braziers placed around the room. Chu Lian didn't feel the slightest bit of chill even when she took off her cloak. She unfolded the blankets and dove into the bed. The warm and soft blanket covering her body made her sigh from comfort. With her entire body ensconced in warmth, the tension in Chu Lian quickly dissipated and she fell asleep. While in a half-dazed state, she felt someone pulling her into the crook of an arm. Due to her experience from before, Chu Lian hadn't fallen into a deep sleep, so this action startled her awake. The moment she opened her eyes, she was faced with He Changdi, whose eyes were as bright as stars in the night sky. Chu Lian turned mute with shock. It took her a moment to take a hold of herself and speak. "You, why are you here?" At this point, He Changdi had already lifted up the blanket and made his way into the warm and cozy nest. He tightened his grip around her and stared calmly at her blushing face. He let out a gentle laugh. "Were you expecting me to sleep in the study instead of our bedroom?" Since he had just lifted up the blanket, it hadn't completely settled down to cover their bodies yet. The whole area from Chu Lian's neck to her chest was exposed to his gaze. The faint lantern light streaming through the curtains on the bed made her exposed snowy white skin look all the more appetizing. He Sanlang sized up the nightclothes she seemed to have worn intentionally with a smile. His voice dipped a few notches as he continued, "If I hadn't come, wouldn't you have worn this robe for nothing?" Chu Lian's mind was still hazy after getting woken up. However, his words made her recall that she was still wearing those extremely revealing nightclothes. Her cute little cheeks lit up in a furious blush instantly. Chu Lian hastily explained, "This was prepared by Momo. I didn't choose this, don't misunderstand." "Senior servant Gui?" Chu Lian quickly nodded. He Changdi's eyes were already alight with humor, but he put on a dignified face and said, "Senior servant Gui is indeed an experienced senior servant, it's about time that I give her a raise." Once he finished speaking, He Changdi pulled away the blanket covering their body in one go. Shyness and anger welled up within Chu Lian. She hadn't expected such a sudden movement from him and her whole body stiffened up in response. It was only when He Changdi looked all over her body with his gleaming eyes that she finally returned to her senses. Realizing that she had nothing to cover herself with, Chu Lian sat up in a panic and tried to cover He Sanlang's eyes with her hands instead. When she raised her slender arms, the two soft lumps under her clothes were squeezed together, forming a deep ravine that called out to the beholder. The Adam's apple on He Changdi's throat trembled as he gulped down his drool. Unfortunately, his eyes were immediately covered in the next second. Chu Lian's soft hands blocked He Changdi's invading gaze. Her face was completely flushed as she said furiously, "You're not allowed to look." He Changdi didn't know what to do right now. Wasn't his little kitten being too difficult? He was probably the most pitiful husband in the whole capital for getting scolded just for looking at his own wife. It left a bitter taste in his heart. Now that He Changdi's vision was obscured, Chu Lian felt safer. Little did she know that she was merely deceiving herself by delaying the inevitable. It was a rare sight for He Changdi to see her in such a helpless and shy state, so he didn't stop her and let her cover his eyes as she liked. Besides, her hands were so small and she was so tense that she hadn't noticed that her blindfold had already slipped and he could take in everything. Changdi was laughing endlessly inside. His dear wife was just too cute. Chu Lian might have succeeded in blocking Changdi's evil eyes, but she had no way to counter his evil claws. Sanlang reached out to hook her around the waist again and pulled her soft and fragrant body on top of him with barely any effort at all. The bedroom was very warm, so Sanlang wasn't worried about her feeling cold despite her thin clothes. Chu Lian could feel the burning heat of his hand on her waist. She struggled a little in an attempt to break free from his evil claws, but it was pointless as she was imprisoned in his embrace. Chapter 471, Nuptial Wine, 2. Her attempt at struggling made Changdi stiffen up even more. The dangerous swelling from a certain part of Sanlang's body made the huffed-up kitten on top of him quieten down. Chu Lian laid in Sanlang's embrace stiffly, not daring to move at all. Her hands were still on his eyes. This position was extremely uncomfortable for her, but she felt too embarrassed to put down her hands. The hand that Sanlang had wrapped around her waist was now rubbing her back in a soothing motion. He said with a chuckle, "Put down your hands." Chu Lian shook her head first before realizing that he couldn't see her action since his eyes were covered. She coughed awkwardly and attempted to start a negotiation. "I can put down my hands, but only if you let me change my clothes, okay?" Changdi found this really funny. Even at this point, his little kitten was still trying to flee. He stopped being courteous and used his other hand to grab hold of her slender wrists. He easily pulled away both of her hands from his eyes. Chu Lian hadn't expected him to resort to brute force, so she tried to struggle subconsciously. However, Changdi reacted by chiding her in a cold manner. "Stop moving." Sanlang had always possessed a naturally chilly temperament. After spending a few months with the Northern Army and experiencing real fights on the battlefield, his aura had been forged into one of blood and steel. When he reprimanded someone now, the air around him was truly frightening. Chu Lian was also shocked still by him. Now that the woman on his chest had stopped struggling, Changdi was able to take a good look at her. He continued to caress her back as he turned around, picked up a gold cup from the side table and passed it to Chu Lian. When Chu Lian returned to her senses, she had already accepted the golden cup that Changdi had passed to her. She looked down at the contents of the cup before bringing it closer and sniffing at it. She tilted her head in confusion and asked, "This is wine?" Changdi reached out to the side again to pick up an identical cup. He tapped it against the one in Chu Lian's hand with a light clink before nodding. With an averted gaze and a light tone, he explained, "Nuptial wine." Despite how soft his voice had become, Chu Lian heard him clearly. Nuptial wine. Her mind flew back to their wedding night. Back then, Changdi had poured away the nuptial wine prepared by the bridal attendant right in front of her, throwing her into a state of stunned shock. Was he trying to make up for what happened then by offering her nuptial wine now? Noticing that the kitten on his chest hadn't lifted up the cup to her lips, Sanlang's expression became a little more awkward. He adjusted his posture and coughed once. He humbled his tone to ask, "Liana, what happened back then was my mistake. I shouldn't have poured away the nuptial wine. Will you let me make up for that today?" Chu Lian rolled her eyes at him. Making up for that? Had this guy ever thought of how horrified and disappointed he had made her when he had gone insane then? She didn't really feel like forgiving him, but when she thought of the time they had spent together and how he had saved her without any regard for his own safety, she couldn't bear to do that to him. Changdi wasn't made of steel after all. He couldn't bear watching as his wife refused to forgive him. Panic arose in him as he stared fixedly at the nuptial wine in their hands. He recalled the instructions of the bridal attendant on their wedding night. They had to drink half from each cup of nuptial wine for their marriage to last forever. Thus, Chu Lian was met with the spectacle of the frosty Sanlang emptying the wine in his cup into his mouth. However, it seemed like that wasn't enough for him. He grabbed her wrist and poured the contents of her cup into his mouth as well. Chu Lian. Had this fellow's mind snapped from her lengthy silence? The moment the strange thought appeared in Chu Lian's mind, she was pulled back into Sanlang's embrace. She felt a slight chill on her lips before warm wine flowed into her mouth. A forceful tongue slid in as well, forcing her to swallow all of the spicy alcohol. Chapter 472, Conjugal Love, 1. Once all of the wine had slid down her throat, he twined their tongues together in a dance until Chu Lian was gasping for breath. It was only when her hands tightened around the lapels of He Changdis' sleep robe that he finally let her go. Chu Lian's face was completely red and she didn't even know whether it was from the heat of the alcohol or He Changdis' passionate kiss. She gulped air down into her burning lungs and glared at her husband in complaint. However, her almond-shaped eyes were misted over with tears now, shining with the reflection of the lantern light and looking especially innocent. That lovely sight was pushing the last remnants of He Changdis' control. He took in a deep breath himself, as if trying to calm the rising tides in his body. He Changdis' gaze fixed upon the woman before him as his pupils dilated. He shifted his body, preparing to start another passionate kiss. Chu Lian's heart was about to leap out of her chest from how nervous she was. She quickly raised her hands to stop him. She complained pitifully, "He Changdi, it's all your fault. My mouth is filled with the taste of alcohol now. I don't like it. Can you let me up to rinse it out?" When He Sanlang's only response was to continue staring at her with sealed lips, Chu Lian couldn't help the twitch at the corner of her mouth. Her watery eyes darted from side to side in thought before she moved her body back. She tried putting on an eagerly attentive tone. "Husband, I saw that you didn't eat much earlier. Why don't we order some supper? Xian mentioned that she made some red date and bird's nest porridge and she's keeping it warm on the stove. I'm a little hungry now too." He Changdi finally spoke up in a husky voice, the tail end of his sentence rising with implication. "Liana, are you worried that I won't have enough strength later tonight?" Chu Lian stiffened up in surprise. It took her a second before she realized what he meant. Her face exploded into a furious blush once again. She hadn't expected that this gloomy fellow would turn into such a perverted scoundrel in front of her. Chu Lian stammered, not even daring to look at him now. Not at all. Is there anything else you'd like to say now, Liana? Just say it all at once. You probably won't be able to speak later." He Changdi purposely emphasized his words again to hint at what was coming up, causing the blush on Chu Lian's cheeks to glow even brighter. Chu Lian was looking everywhere except at He Changdi right now. Since they had both drunk the nuptial wine, there was a light scent of alcohol on their breaths. An idea sparked in Chu Lian's mind and she quickly said, "We just ate at grandmother's place and we just drank some wine. You probably haven't taken a bath yet, right? I'll go and ask Wenqing and the rest to prepare the bath." After blurting all of that out, she tried to climb off the bed. However, He Sanlang's leg was in her way. Of course he wouldn't be letting her off so easily. Chu Lian huffed as she shoved his leg away with all her might. She had just managed to take a step forward on the soft carpet at the bottom of the bed when He Changdi grabbed hold of her slender waist yet again without any effort. The nightclothes Chu Lian was wearing were simply too see-through. Her curves were completely visible under the mint-colored robe that fell down to their ankles. He could see the loose pink pants and light green top she had underneath. Even the shiny strap of her halter top underwear was visible in the dim light. He Changdis' pupils dilated. With a slight pull of his arm, Chu Lian was already back in bed. He leaned over her as his wandering palm caressed the soft skin around her waist. Squished under her husband, Chu Lian didn't have the energy to think about her seductive nightwear any longer. She stared up at him innocently with her wide, watery eyes, looking exactly like a little rabbit waiting to be eaten. "You really aren't going to bathe?" The soft and gentle tones of Chu Lian's voice made He Changdi stiffen up even more. He reached out with one hand to stroke her smooth, porcelain cheeks. With a puff of breath by her ear, he spoke huskily, "I bathed when I came back to the estate earlier. There's no need to waste any more time." Chapter 473, Conjugal Love, 2. Once he finished speaking, Chu Lian could feel some wetness on her sensitive earlobes as he sucked on them. Chu Lian tried to push him away and tried to retort in her urgency, "But it's already been a whole afternoon and we just drank wine." He Changdi couldn't let her off any longer now that they were already here. Chu Lian was his lawfully wedded wife after all. This was supposed to have happened a long time ago. Since they were in mutual love now, he had done pretty well to restrain himself up to this point. Before Chu Liuan could finish her words, He Changdi grabbed the tip of her chin. His dark eyes were slightly narrowed as they roamed all over her body, like a conqueror looking over his territory. He Changdi's gaze passed over her ruddy red lips, then down to her slightly open collar, then her inviting collarbones. He abruptly bent down and captured her parted, tender lips. Once he had the first taste, he could no longer hold back his desire to lick and explore her mouth. Chu Lian panted for breath, her cheeks flushed red again, as she hit his sturdy chest in protest. Unfortunately, He Changdi easily caught her hands and trapped them between their bodies so that she couldn't move. When He Sanlang felt that the woman under him had already given in, he pushed past her teeth with his tongue and tangled with hers. The smell of alcohol mixed with the aroma of the incense burning in the room made Chu Lian's mind dazed. Her husband had trapped her so utterly within his hold that she couldn't bring up any strength to struggle, even if she still wanted to. As if sensing Chu Lian's remaining reluctance, He Sanlang tightened his hold around her wrists. Chu Lian's waist finally relaxed, indicating that she had completely given in. Chu Lian wanted to cry inside as she thought to herself dejectedly. It looked like she wouldn't be able to escape tonight. Why was He Changdi so overbearing? He Changdi loosened his hold a little once he felt that his wife had stopped trying to escape. He let go of her lips, allowing her to gulp in air once again. Following that, he littered gentle kisses on her lips and played with her tongue. The hand he was using to hold her chin slowly moved downwards. By this time, He Changdi's cold countenance had already taken on a tinge of red. His eyes were like dark mirrors, the only image reflected in them was his absolutely lovely wife. He lowered his gaze and stopped his kisses, only to switch to licking her trembling tongue. Chu Lian felt a sudden chill on her shoulders and realized that He Changdi had already slipped her thin nightclothes off. She subconsciously tried to cover herself up again by sitting up and pulling forcefully at the blanket nearby, but He Sanlang took that chance to catch the thin cloth ties on her back and pull them loose. By the time Chu Lian had grabbed hold of the edge of the blanket, all she had left on her was that thin pair of sleeping pants. Her eyelashes trembled as she looked up in alarm. He Changdi had never been so forward with her before. Unfortunately for her, she had only grasped a tiny bit of the blanket and the rest of it was still trapped under He Sanlang's legs. She couldn't move it with the power contained in her slender arms. The pitiful amount of blanket she had was only able to cover her upper half, leaving her lower half exposed. He Sanlang's usual calm and cool expression had already crumbled into a light blush. As he admired how the red hue of the mandarin duck blanket complemented his lovely wife's fair skin, his breathing got a little heavier. Chu Lian didn't have any fight left in her by now. She held onto the corner of the blanket to protect what was left of her modesty as she tried to appeal to her husband with a pitiful expression and a soft voice. "Husband, please let me off for tonight." Chapter 474, Husband and Wife. 1. He Changdi watched as she clung tightly to the corner of the blanket, which was only covering the most important spot on her body. Everything else was practically bared to his gaze. The faint lamplight filtering through the gauzy bed curtains gave her fair skin a lovely glow, enticing him. Chu Lian was like a lamb placed on the table for slaughter. The sight soothed He Changdi's sense of urgency. He raised his body slightly and stripped off his top. He asked her with a trace of humor, "How would you like me to spare you, Liana?" Chu Lian stared back in a daze. That's right, how exactly did she want him to spare her? They were husband and wife already. This was something inevitable. However, his hurried actions had made her a little afraid and uneasy. Chu Lian continued holding on to the corner of the blanket as she asked him in a soft and coaxing manner, "How about doing this another day, husband? We've just returned to the capital today and you even went to the palace, so you must be tired. Why don't we postpone this to tomorrow? It's already late, let's rest for the night." He Sanlang held back the urge to burst into laughter. His little kitten was actually trying to escape even at this point. He casually tossed his inner clothes to the floor, revealing the fine lines of his body and his well-defined abs to Chu Lian's eyes. He Changdi wasn't going to let her avoid him forever. He pulled away the blanket in his eyes and whispered huskily into her ear, "All right, I'll listen to you. Well, rest early." Chu Lian barely had the time to let out a surprised gasp when He Sanlang pounced on her. Within a few minutes, the couple was intertwined like a pair of mandarin ducks and the sounds of lovemaking resounded in the room. Unfortunately, as bold and strong as He Sanlang was, he was still a virgin. The couple's first time together was over in less than 15 minutes. Chu Lian's face was completely flushed red. Her pleading had landed on deaf ears, so in a last show of temper, she pulled over the blanket and bit onto it, resisting the foreign waves of pleasure rushing over her body. Her mind was completely hazy and dazed. She wailed inwardly, not knowing how long the torture would last. Her body felt like jelly all over and she was on the verge of giving in. It was Chu Lian's first time, so she didn't get to enjoy much of the pleasure of this conjugal activity. On the other hand, He Sanlang had already become an addict. Just as Chu Lian was wondering when this would end, she felt a strange sensation in the lower half of her body. Her strong husband froze up and the stiff object inside her softened. Neither of them had expected their first time to be over so quickly. Chu Lian slowly opened her eyes, only to be met with a black-faced He Changdi. Chu Lian quickly used up all of her restraint to hold back the urge to laugh. Luckily, she succeeded in her efforts. Otherwise, her lunatic husband might have taken that as a challenge to make her bedridden the next day. Since it was already over, Chu Lian bore with the soreness in her body and reached out with her wobbly arms to push him. She blinked innocently and spoke in a slightly hoarse voice, "He Sanlang, I'm feeling too sore so I'm going to take a bath." He Sanlang was still immersed in the shock from the blow of finishing so quickly. Thanks to his momentary lapse, Chu Lian was able to make her escape. Chu Lian quickly scrambled off the bed, bearing with the soreness between her legs. She grabbed the nightclothes by the side of the bed and pulled the robe over her body before running towards the bathroom. Although she was stumbling a little, she finally made it. Chu Lian rang the bell to summon Wenqing in. Wenqing entered from the servants' entrance, her head lowered as she waited obediently for third young madam's orders. Chapter 475, Husband and Wife, 2. Chu Lian's strength had already been completely sapped by the activities just now, so she leaned against the screen and told Wenqing to prepare a hot bath. When that was done, Chu Lian entered the fragrant, steaming bath and let out a comfortable sigh of relief. Strength was slowly returning to her limbs. When she recalled what she had just done with He Changdi in bed, a furious blush flared back to life on her cheeks. She covered her burning cheeks with her hands and soaked in the bath in an absent-minded daze until the sound of footsteps resounded behind her. The moment she turned around, she was met with the gloomer-looking He Sanlang. Her husband stripped off his sleeping robe and tossed it haphazardly to one side before stepping right into the bathtub. She didn't have any time to react before He Changdi was already in the bath with her. With another pull of his long arms, she was already wrapped in his naked embrace. Chu Lian's eyes widened in shock. It took her a moment to find her voice again. "He Changdi, what are you doing? Get out." The usual cold layer of frost had returned to He Sanlang's handsome face. He scooped up some warm water and poured it over Chu Lian's smooth shoulders before suddenly bending over to nibble her earlobe. His deep and hoarse voice echoed in the bathroom, "What am I doing? I'm just taking a bath." Chu Lian saw that his hands were starting to wander, so she started struggling. The level of water in the bath dwindled as water splashed all over the bathroom. In the end, they weren't able to finish their bath as half of the water in the tub had spilled over. Chu Lian let out a shrill cry as she was carried back to their bed by He Changdi. He Sanlang seemed to be trying to prove himself to her as he entered her continuously, ignoring Chu Lian's pleas for mercy. At last, he managed to last longer than their first hurried coupling. Near the end, Chu Lian didn't even have the strength to lift a finger any longer. The moment He Changdi had finished, she dozed right off into sleep from fatigue. He Changdi was covered in beads of sweat all over, but his mood was the highest it had ever been. He pulled out and went off to the bathroom to clean himself. When he was done, he found a handkerchief and dipped it in warm water to clean Chu Lian's body. When he finished cleaning his wife and realized that red marks had been left all over her snow-white skin from his excessive use of force, guilt rose within him and he started feeling vexed with himself. He helped Chu Lian into a clean set of nightclothes and gently fed her a few spoonfuls of the warm honey water on the side table. Finally, he changed the bedsheets before carefully setting her back down on the bed and snuggling right in with her, gaze fixed on her defenseless sleeping expression. Outside, in the servants' wing, Xian was feeling sorry for her mistress. She knew that Chu Lian hadn't consummated her marriage with He Changdi on their wedding night and that this was the couple's first time together. Even at the start, when there hadn't been much movement from the bedroom, she had still been extremely worried. Later on, after Wenqing had gone in to prepare a hot bath, the sounds and movements coming from inside the bedroom were even louder than before. She could even hear her young madam's soft cries. Chu Lian had never cried in front of her servants before. Xian was frantic with worry, afraid that third young master was abusing her mistress. She had listened to the gossiping senior servants in the past when she had been bored. The servants had talked about how there was a servant being abused by her husband, who took out the stresses of his job on her and beat her until she cried for mercy. The more she thought about it, the more worried she got until she couldn't take it any longer. Xian abruptly stood up and spoke, "I have to go in to check on third young madam. I won't let anyone bully third young madam, even if it's third young master." Wenqing was alarmed by Xian's declaration. How could she really let Xian enter the bedroom? If the two of them entered the bedroom at this time, their lives would likely be forfeit. She practiced martial arts, so her hearing was more acute than Xian's. Furthermore, senior servant Zhong had specially educated them on the birds and the bees, so she was much more knowledgeable than Xian on these matters. It wasn't easy for her to explain it so openly. However, she understood that it was always hard for women on their first time. Although she felt for third young madam as well, she was more afraid of third young master. They were just servants, so it was better if they didn't interfere with their master's activities. Chapter 476, Early Morning, 1. Wenqing held Xian's arm and shook her head. She whispered, "Sister Xian, you don't have to worry so much. Third young master usually dotes on third young madam, why would he bully her? As servants, we shouldn't interfere with our master's business. Moreover, third young madam didn't call for us. We can't just go in like that. Also, think about third young madam's personality. If she was really being bullied, wouldn't she call for help?" Although Xian was still worried, Wenqing ultimately convinced her. After their masters had returned to Songtao Court, they were able to see for themselves how much third young master cared for third young madam. Also, third young madam was someone who would definitely return an eye for an eye. If she really suffered any grievance, she wouldn't endure it silently. The two personal maidservants stayed up until midnight. Xian finally breathed a sigh of relief when they could no longer hear any movement within the room. Wenqing finally relaxed as well, her face flushed. Since their masters had settled down for the night, they didn't need two servants to stay up for the night shift. In the end, Wenqing told Xian to take a rest and leave her to keep watch through the night in the side room by herself. After leaving the room, Xian didn't immediately go back to her room to rest. She headed to senior servant Gui's room first to report that the young couple had finally consummated their marriage. Senior servant Gui was still awake, waiting for Xian's report. After receiving the news, senior servant Gui clasped her hands together and bowed in prayer. A smile appeared on her face. She pushed Xian and said, "Well, I can rest assured now. If third young madam gives birth to a son in the future, I'll be able to enjoy my old age in peace. It's getting late now. You should hurry and go sleep." Xian watched as senior servant Gui got up from bed instead and started getting dressed. She asked curiously, "Momo, why are you getting up when it's already this late?" Senior servant Gui grinned so widely that her eyes disappeared. "Sixth Miss has a thin and weak body. This first night must have been tough for her. I'm going to brew some nourishing soup, so she can drink some first thing in the morning." Seeing how excited senior servant Gui was, Xian didn't stop her. "Momo, do rest earlier when you're done. I'll go back to my room first." Xian and Fuyan lived in the same room. When Xian returned to her room, She saw that the room was still lit. Her brows creased into a frown and she muttered to herself, "It's already so late, why hasn't Fuyen slept yet? What's that girl doing at this hour?" She quickly walked towards the door and tried pushing it open, only to find out that someone had actually locked it from the inside. Chu Lian's personal maidservants all lived together in a small courtyard within Songtao Court. They usually took turns to be on standby with their masters at night, so the courtyard entrance and the room doors were never locked. There was also a senior servant guarding the courtyard entrance at night. It was even more strictly guarded outside, so nothing had ever happened before. A trace of suspicion was aroused in Xian's heart. She called out softly to Fuyen from outside the door. Fuyen suffered a fright when she heard the door being pushed. She had been expecting Xian to be on duty until morning since she was taking the night shift. Who could have thought that Xian would return to their room at this time? She panicked and hid the letter she had been clutching in her hands under her pillow. She straightened out her dress and calmed her breathing before opening the door as if nothing had happened. When the door opened from the inside, Xian immediately entered the room, only to see that Fuyen hadn't even changed her clothes. It was obvious that she hasn't slept yet, so she asked, "It's so late, why aren't you resting? It's your turn to serve third young madam tomorrow." Fuyen went over to the bed and sat down. She picked up the sewing basket next to her and said, "I wanted to finish sewing the flower on this handkerchief before going to sleep. I didn't realize that time flew by so quickly. So it's already midnight." Xian furrowed her brows. "There's no need to stay up so late. You can work on the handkerchief anytime. Alright, go to sleep now. If something goes wrong tomorrow, Momo won't spare you. Millimeter, I'll listen to Sister Xian. I'll pack my things up and sleep now. It won't happen again." Chapter 477, Early Morning, 2. Xian looked at Fuyen from the corner of her eyes as she changed her clothes. She felt that Fuyen was acting rather strange tonight, but she hadn't been able to find out anything after questioning her. In the end, she decided to let it go. The light in the room was quickly snuffed out. Fuyen reached for the letter under her pillow in the dark, her eyes wavering. Finally, she gritted her teeth and made her decision. Chu Lian slowly opened her eyes. Her mind was still in a haze since she had just woken up. However, once she moved, her whole body began to ache and she almost cried out loud. Memories from last night suddenly rushed into her mind like a tidal wave. Chu Lian was stunned by her recollections for a moment before annoyance and anger overtook her mind. That He San Lang. Last night, he had actually ignored her wishes and tortured her like that. Chu Lian turned over and noticed that He Changdi wasn't there. She reached out to touch the bedsheets beside her and realized that the area where he had been lying was already cold. She wrinkled her brows and prepared to call for a servant to come in. Wenqing heard the slight movement from outside and quietly entered the bedroom. She stood beside the bed, where the curtains had been let down, shielding Chu Lian from her gaze. She asked in a soft tone, "Third young madam, do you need this servant's assistance?" Chu Lian hadn't expected Wenqing to be waiting outside. Blood instantly rushed into her cheeks. She gave an awkward cough before asking in her slightly hoarse voice, "What time is it? Where's third young master?" Although He Changdi had been bestowed the title of Marquis An Yuan and an official position, he hadn't split off from the family yet. Their elders, Matriarch He, Countess Jingan, and eldest young madam, were also present in the estate, so everyone in the Jingan estate still called him third young master. Thus, Chu Lian was still third young madam. Wenqing smiled and replied, "Third young madam, please don't worry. It's only around 7 in the morning. Third young master went to the martial arts arena an hour ago. It was February right now, so it was still chilly in the capital. Although the bedroom was heated, it was much more comfortable to stay in bed. Since it was still early, Chu Lian couldn't be bothered to wake up. She hadn't gotten a good rest anyways. She spoke to Wenqing briefly before turning right around and going back to sleep. Wenqing smiled and tiptoed back out of the room. Third young madam had probably been tired out last night. Before third young master had gone to the martial arts arena, he had instructed her to let third young madam sleep more. Even if third young madam wanted to get up, she would have had to persuade her otherwise. He Changdi came back about half an hour later. Wenqing and Wenlan, who were now on duty in the outer room, handed him a wet towel. He Sanlang's gaze swept over them. Is your young madam awake? The corners of Wenqing's lips were still tilted upwards with humor. She woke up once half an hour ago and asked after third young master. Then she went back to sleep. He Changdi's stern and icy face softened a little. He handed back the towel in his hand before striding into the bedroom with his hands clasped behind him. It was just a little over an hour since he had last seen her, but he was already starting to miss her terribly. He wanted to see that lovely, sweet face of hers immediately. Chu Lian was still deep in slumber when she felt something ticklish on her nose. She impatiently reached out with one hand, wanting to brush it off. Her slender wrist emerged from the loose sleeve of her nightgown. The little strength that she used was nothing to He Sanlang. There were a few obvious red spots on her pale wrist, which looked strangely similar to the marks on her neck. The light in He Changdi's deep eyes darkened. He held her fair arm and started dropping light kisses over the marks on her arm. Next, he gently tucked her arm back into the warm blankets. He took off his shoes and shifted closer to Chu Lian before pulling her into his embrace, blanket and all. That action finally woke Chu Lian up. She opened up her almond-shaped eyes, looking slightly dazed with a lovely blush on her face. Chapter 478, Early Morning, 2. The moment she opened her eyes, it was He Changdi who fell into her sight. By the time she was able to overcome that short instant of confusion, He Sanlang had already tried placing a gentle kiss on her soft lips. Chu Lian immediately reacted by turning her head to avoid it. Her temper peaked, she said, He Changdi, you lied to me last night. Her whole body was wrapped up in the blanket within his embrace. She couldn't move at all. At this moment, she could only move her lips. He Changdi couldn't hold back his chuckles when he saw her flushed face. When did I ever lie? When Chu Lian recalled his shameless and insatiable demands from last night, she gnashed her teeth in frustration. However, she had already experienced for herself how well he could twist his words. Moreover, they were lying together on the bed right now and her whole body was still aching. She couldn't afford to provoke him. Chu Lian pouted and turned her head away. She didn't want to answer his question. He Sanlang stared at her reddened earlobe for a moment. He lowered his head to suck on it, his warm breath puffing over Chu Lian's ear as he whispered huskily, It was my bad last night. Does it still hurt? The blush on Chu Lian's ears extended to her entire face after hearing his question, especially since they were in such an intimate pose. She pursed her lips together and remained silent. It was too embarrassing to talk about this. Moreover, He Changdi wasn't a doctor. He wouldn't be able to help even if she told him that it was hurting. When He Sanlang saw that his wife was evading his gaze with a bashful look, he could guess what her answer would have been. He Sanlang was worried about her, so he suggested, Don't go over to visit grandmother and mother this morning. I'll send someone to let them know. Chu Lian's eyes widened and she immediately shook her head upon hearing his suggestion. You can't. She had been completely fine and healthy yesterday. If she didn't visit her elders today for the usual morning greetings, what would everyone else think? Chu Lian didn't want to discuss this topic with him any longer. She shifted her position and looked at the handsome man beside her. She brought up her own question, You went out to exercise in the morning? A spark of discomfort flashed through He Changdi's deep eyes, but he quickly recovered his usual calm. He squeezed the lovely woman in his embrace. Millimeter, it's an old habit I've had even before I went to the north. When I joined the northern border troops later, Uncle Qian was really strict, so the time I spent on training became even longer. He Sanlang didn't dare to speak the truth. Actually, after consummating their marriage, he had been too excited to fall to asleep last night. He held her in his arms and just stared at her all night and only managed to nap for about 3 hours. When he had woken up, it was still dark outside. Chu Lian had been sleeping on his chest with her rosy cheeks, fair skin, and bright red lips. Moreover, her nightclothes had gotten a little disheveled in her sleep. A man's lust was the strongest in the morning. He Sanlang was also at the age when his body was full of vigor. With his beloved wife sleeping in his arms, it was unbearable. However, afraid of hurting Chu Lian, He Sanlang pursed his lips with a grim expression and headed out to the martial arts arena to vent. Ahem. He also paid a visit to Great Dr. Miao on the way. Chu Lian nodded without noticing the hidden meaning in He Changdi's eyes. She wriggled a little and complained, He Changdi, let go of me. It's getting late. I need to get up. While Chu Lian was struggling, He Changdi suddenly bent down and whispered something into her ear. Chu Lian instantly froze, the healthy blush on her face instantly fading to a pale pallor. She seriously wanted to strangle He Changdi right now. You actually went to look for Great Dr. Miao. Chapter 479, Early Morning, 4. He Sanlang had a cold expression on his face, but his voice was hoarse. Be good. I'll accompany you to greet grandmother after you apply the medicine. Ahem. He had done a careful inspection while cleaning her up last night. That area was red and swollen because he had been too reckless. Chu Lian wailed and covered her head with the blanket. She felt too ashamed to face anyone else right now. About 20 minutes later, Chu Lian was still curled up in the blanket, covering her flushed face. She slowly calmed down as she listened to the sound of water coming from the bathroom. He Sanlang had actually ignored her opposition and personally applied the medicine for her. It served him right that he had to take a cold bath. Chu Lian thought angrily. Afterwards, she called Wenlan and Fuyan in to help her. Chu Lian was still feeling somewhat uncomfortable, so she walked about awkwardly when she got off the bed. It took a few rounds around the bedroom before she got used to the strange new feeling. Wenlan was keeping a happy smile hidden with her head lowered, but the look in Fuyan's downcast eyes were filled with envy and jealousy. When He Changdi came out of the bathroom wearing a loose robe, before Wenlan could walk up to him, Fuyan had already beaten her to it and handed him the dry towel in her hand. She attempted to reach out and help him dry his dark hair, but He Sanlang cast a cold gaze over the two maidservants. Wenlan immediately bobbed towards her two masters and turned to leave. When she noticed that Fuyan was still standing there in a daze, she grabbed Fuyan's hand and dragged her out before third young master got angry. When they got to the outer room, Fuyan angrily flung off Wenlan's hand and scolded her. Wenlan, what are you doing? Wenlan took a deep breath and glared at Fuyan. Fuyan, can't you tell? Third young master doesn't like us staying in there. Fuyan snorted, you're just being overly cautious. Third young master didn't even say anything. Wenlan's brows furrowed even more when she heard her reply. Fuyan, I'm going to give you some advice. Even if you came as part of third young madam's dowry, you still need to know your place. Remember Ming Yang. Wenlan turned and left the outer room after leaving her warning. She was starting to dislike Fuyan even more. Did Fuyan really think third young madam was an idiot? Although third young madam was usually very kind and friendly and didn't like to make a fuss over small matters, that didn't mean that she was a naive person who would be easily fooled. Even if they didn't have a third young madam, did Fuyan seriously think that third young master was someone she could afford to provoke? Fuyan hadn't gone to the northern border with them, so she hadn't seen how many people third young master had killed on the battlefields. Otherwise, she wouldn't have these presumptuous thoughts. Fuyan couldn't care less about Wenlan's warning. Third young master might be treating third young madam as sweet as honey right now, but wait until he learns about third young madam's betrayal. Once he finds out about her dalliance with another man, there was bound to be a trace of doubt in his heart. No man can stand a woman's betrayal, especially if she is his wife. Fuyan smirked. She had been waiting for so long. Wasn't it all for this day? He Sanlang's expression finally softened up once the two handmaids had left the inner room. He walked over to Chu Lian and handed her the towel in his hand. Chu Lian rolled her eyes before taking it. She got up and made him sit on the stool in front of the dressing table. She moved to his back and started drying off his wet hair gently. Weren't Wenlan and Fuyan around just now? Chu Lian asked with a slight pout. He Sanlang's dark eyes looked at Chu Lian through the bronze mirror. His voice was cold and stiff. I don't like them serving me. Chu Lian couldn't help smiling as she recalled what senior servant Zhong had told her before. Before she had married He Changdi, Songtao Court didn't have any ranked maidservants at all. There had only been a few menial servants responsible for cleaning. He Changdis' basic needs had always been handled by Lai Yu. I really don't know how to serve others. Chu Lian was speaking the truth. She really didn't know how to take care of others. After experiencing the luxury of the maidservant's service, her actions couldn't be considered a proper service. Humor shone in He Changdis' deep eyes. I need you to take care of me, except in bed. Chu Lian was stunned by his words. Her face instantly flushed and she threw the towel at He Changdi. If he didn't need her help, then he could do it himself. Chu Lian felt that just throwing the towel at him wasn't enough, so she also shot a glare at him. What was wrong with this He Sanlang? Ever since their relationship had progressed to the next step, he had been constantly making dirty jokes. How annoying. Chapter 480, To Manage the Household, 1. Although the Emperor had already verbally appointed He Changdi as an administrator of the Department of Appointments, he hadn't taken up the post officially yet as he had just returned to the capital not too long ago. He would have to go to the imperial court to receive the role through an official ceremony eventually. After he and the other accomplished officers from the north had returned to the capital, they had all been granted half a month of leave after their meeting with the Emperor. During this period, He Sanlang planned to spend more quality time with his family. The couple continued whispering sweet nothings to each other in the bedroom. Once they had their breakfast, it was time for them to pay their respects to their elders. The two first visited Qingxi Hall, before going over to Countess Jinggan's courtyard. Countess Jinggan was leaning slightly skewed against the headboard of a bed with a thick quilt covering her body. She seemed to be in great spirits, perhaps thanks to He Changdis' safe return from the north and the news of his great accomplishments. Her previously thin and pale face had now gained a little more color, making her seem more lively. He Changdi and Chu Lian went to visit Great Dr. Miao together and heard from him that Countess Jinggan's condition was taking a turn for the better. He was preparing to use the Snow Mountain Mist's flower in a few more days to make some medicine to permanently cure the root of Countess Jinggan's illness. The young couple was seated by Countess Jinggan's bed. Countess Jinggan held Chu Lian's hand as she chatted with them. In the middle of their conversation, Countess Jinggan said with a smile, "Liana, I've missed your cooking while you were away." A slight smile surfaced on Chu Lian's face. "What would you like to eat, mother? As long as it's good for your health, I'll make it right away." Before she had departed for the north, Chu Lian had regularly sent portions of food to the other courtyards whenever she cooked up something new in Songtao Court. She assumed that Countess Jinggan had become accustomed to her cooking. Countess Jinggan looked to be in serious thought for a moment. "The candied kumquats I ate the last time were very good, but kumquats are hard to find right now. Would you be able to use hawthorns instead?" Chu Lian nodded with a smile. "Yes, hawthorns are fine too. I'll make them myself and send them over to you myself when I'm done, mother." Countess Jinggan chatted with the two for some time before letting them leave. They left the bedroom and headed out to the parlor, but the moment they had just stepped out of the parlor, Chu Lian's footsteps came to a halt. He Changdi found it strange, so he followed the direction of her gaze and looked towards the corridor on the right. They watched as a pregnant woman with a protruding belly walked towards them while being supported by two servants. The pregnant woman seemed pretty young. She was wearing a loose apple-red robe with a matching brocade cloak. Her hair was shaped into a simple bun, with just an ordinary golden hairpin holding it up. Although her face had become chubbier, Chu Lian was still able to recognize her instantly. She was Countess Jinggan's personal maidservant, Miaozhen. Chu Lian hadn't expected Miaozhen's belly to have grown so quickly in the few months that she had been away. When Chu Lian thought of her eldest brother-in-law He Changchi, she felt sorry for him. He Changdi and Chu Lian were standing in a rather secluded area. They were basically in a blind spot from where Miaozhen was right now. Just as Chu Lian and He Changdi were about to leave, they heard conversation coming from Miaozhen's direction. One of the maidservants supporting Miaozhen asked, "Sister Miaozhen, are you feeling any discomfort today?" Miaozhen smiled and replied, "Not at all, I'm feeling good." The servant then asked, "Sister Miaozhen, are you still craving sour foods?" This time, Miaozhen didn't reply and shyly nodded instead. The servant gave a wide smile. "Sister Miaozhen, my mother said that craving for sour food means that it's a boy and craving for spicy food means that it's a girl. The child in your belly is definitely a little young master. The servant then paused for a moment as if she was afraid that someone might be eavesdropping. She intentionally moved closer to Meowjin's ear and lowered her voice. Our house doesn't have a little young master yet. If Sister Meowjin gives birth to a boy, your position will be stable. She had kept her voice quiet, but Chu Lian was still able to hear every word she said. The brows on Chu Lian's little face furrowed together. Happiness was written all over Meowjin's face at the thought, while the servant supporting her giggled out loud. While Chu Lian was staring blankly at them, He Changdi grabbed her hand. It was still cold in February, so this sent warmth to her icy cold hand. He Sanlang's handsome face reverted back to the grim expression that he put on in front of others. He then stooped over and whispered into Chu Lian's ear, "Let's go." Chu Lian stopped looking in Meowjin's direction and gave a slight nod in response. After getting her agreement, He Changdi quickly pulled her away. Wenlan and the other servants tactfully kept a distance while still following behind their masters. It was only when Chu Lian and He Changdi had finally left the parlor that Meowjin noticed their presence. She immediately stopped in her tracks, subconsciously attempting to greet third young master and madam, but it was impossible for her to catch up with them considering the speed at which He Sanlang was dragging Chu Lian away. The servants by Meowjin's side stared after the tall figure of He Changdi with dazed looks. "Sister Meowjin, is that third young master?" Meowjin nodded. Her brows knitted together, but she didn't speak. She looked away and continued heading towards Countess Jingan's bedroom. You're tuning in to the Dreamy Chapters YouTube channel. We're so grateful for your support and don't forget to subscribe to join us on this incredible journey through captivating stories. Your generosity through donations truly makes a world of difference, as it's the primary source of revenue that allows me to expand and enhance this channel for you. Thank you from the bottom of my heart for being a part of this adventure.